For most of the 1960s, Brian Wilson had been at the height of his powers, penning and producing hit after hit for the Beach Boys. But by the end of the decade, disheartened by the reaction of both his band and his record label to his more ambitious material, he began to withdraw.
There was a lot of pressure on Brian from the record company, give us a hit, give us a hit. And you know, you don't turn that on and off like a faucet.
I think he felt really alone. I mean, I think that he felt like the record company didn't like him, his band didn't like him. So now Brian is feeling this pressure coming from two sides.
Everybody's invested in Brian continuing to work and be Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. But the only guy that didn't want that to happen was Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys.
Suffocated by his past success and isolated within his own band, in the 1970s, Wilson's mental health began to deteriorate, and the songs he did compose for the Beach Boys during this period expressed his inner anguish.
Brian clearly is in a very bad state. People just didn't know what to do about guys who were in that sort of state. This is still very early days in terms of knowledge about addiction, depression, mental problems. People aren't going to rehab. People are just being left to flounder. Nobody really knows what to do.
But after years in the wilderness, by the second half of the 70s, Brian would triumphantly return. Yet the artist who re-emerged was a changed man with new musical ideas.
Brian's a creative guy. He had no thoughts at all about being a Beach Boy. No, he didn't want to be a Beach Boy. No, he didn't want to do surfing songs for sure. He was most comfortable being an artist.
When the Beach Boys emerged in 1961, their blend of intricate vocal harmonies, upbeat rock and roll melodies and lyrical themes capturing the spirit of West Coast youth culture quickly propelled them to the top rank of popular music. And at their center was Brian Wilson, an astonishingly prolific writer and producer who composed the majority of their output. A very visible presence at the start of the band's career, by 1965 his antipathy for life on the road led him to bow out of touring and to solely concentrate on studio work. Having already utilized the talents of Phil Spector's legendary studio musicians, the Wrecking Crew, on several of the band's hits, he began producing and arranging albums predominantly featuring these players while the Beach Boys toured. With the musical landscape changed forever by the British invasion, a new climate began to develop in which artists previously concerned with penning hits started to bring increased sophistication to their work and focused far more on the album rather than individual singles. Following the example set by the Beatles' Rubber Soul, Brian Wilson aimed to be at the forefront of this musical revolution, and the Beach Boys' groundbreaking 1966 LP, Pet Sounds, saw him drive the band into new territory. Yet where this secured it a huge audience in the UK and Europe, the band's record company Capitol were not so prepared for the shift, and released without their full confidence, it failed to ignite the US charts.
It is as great as pop music gets. And it is as sophisticated, intricate and harmonically extraordinary arrangement-wise, texture-wise. It is as great as, you know, as Western pop music has ever got.
Wouldn't it be nice if we were older, then we wouldn't have to wait so long? And wouldn't it be nice to live together in the kind of world where we belong? You know it's gonna make it that much better when we can say goodnight and stay together.
But it was not a record that the pop machine could understand and work with in that sense. And that is why Capitol so quickly rushed out a greatest hits album. It kind of panicked. It just thought, well, this is not 3-minute pop nirvana of the kind that we understand and that teenagers want. And I think that's the problem. You know, Capitol couldn't get behind it. They didn't really understand what it was. It was not the Beach Boys as we had known them.
You know, it seems the more we talk about it, it only makes it worse to live without it.
think the record label in America really let him down, really let him down. And I think this, all of a sudden, this can't do anything wrong guy was made to feel, or probably felt that he'd done something wrong, and he probably started losing a little of his confidence.
Yet that lack of confidence was not evident in the work that followed. Wilson's drive and artistic ambition remained unaffected by the relative failure of Pet Sounds domestically, and ignoring the demands of both bandmates and record label executives that he returned to churning out hits, he instead began work on even more adventurous projects. The first was the single Good Vibrations, a track that eventually took months to complete. Establishing a new method of operation, Wilson composed and recorded several sections of music that were later edited together to produce a distinctive whole. The experiment worked both critically and commercially, and the Beach Boys' first million-selling #1 single confirmed Wilson as a peerless innovator. The next project, however, was to consume him. Working at an even greater distance from the band, Wilson had welcomed a host of new collaborators into his fold, most significantly the lyricist Van Dyke Parks, and through an atmosphere of great levity and experimentation, began creating the album Smile. In keeping with the times, drugs played a major part in the increasingly zany proceedings, with session players dressed as firemen, and Brian composing songs with his piano in a sandbox.
The sandbox was just a box that he had made. It was full of sand that he could sit in, feel like he was at the beach. Mine was not to ask why, nor to reason why. This was his house and his sandbox.
Writing a song like Surf's Up, and he's got his shoes and socks off, and there's a piano there, and he's got his feet in the sand. Shut your eyes, and you're writing about Surf's Up. I mean, how perfect, you know?
I just thought it was silly. It was all in fun. It was just silly stuff. And as long as we were making records and getting wealthy off of it all, I don't think anyone was going to complain.
I don't think that anybody had any idea that it would end up in the problems that Brian would have emotionally eventually, in terms of not being able to get out of bed and the sand in the house. And I don't think anybody, you know, we didn't really look at that as something really crazy. It was just so typically nondescript, which really fit the pattern that Brian was sort of in at that time. The things he was doing was surviving through the pressure of the record company trying to say, give us hit songs. He was kind of finding this other place where he could survive without writing for the band another In My Room or 409 or something. He was just making music that he heard in his head, which was probably one of the scariest things.
But Wilson's ability to capture and structure the music that he was hearing in his head was becoming impaired. As his drug use increased, he became more uncertain of how to arrange the various musical segments he had composed. And when the Beach Boys arrived to begin recording the eccentric vocal arrangements, Wilson's control in the studio was faltering.
The band worked so hard with Brian to try and to make this happen. But I just know Brian was, you know, very tense, and it wasn't the Brian that I'd worked with, you know. I just think his success was so big, he might have just been thinking, well, how am I going to do this?
Despite his uncertainty, the music recorded during these seemingly endless sessions was revolutionary, unlike any work ever to emerge from a mainstream artist.
I think we would have had a 1-2 punch as far as people. Let's forget about selling stuff. Just think of it as pure art. Brian would have had a 1-2 punch. It would have been great.
Yet the creation of pure art was of little importance to some of his bandmates. Singer Mike Love, in particular, was fiercely opposed to this new work. Totally uninterested in progression and innovation, he saw the Beach Boys as entertainers, not artists, and his distaste for Van Dyke Park's contributions led the lyricist to leave the project. Unwilling to fight his corner, unable to control his vision, Brian Wilson began to decline.
I remember one night we were at the house, and Brian would be in his, he had a king-size bed in this room, and he would lay in bed. And he was getting a little bit harder on himself, and he was overweight. There was no doubt that he was eating poorly, and there was a seriousness about Brian. There was something happening that was a lot deeper going on, and you saw there was a lot of illness in the room, and there's a lot of illness around the whole. You began to sense the uncomfortableness of the sand in the room and the piano sitting in the sand, which when you first walk in is like, okay, that's funny. And then if you really think about it, it's not so funny. And then Brian and the separation with the band and not being able to kind of go to Mike or go to Carl and trust their opinion. And their opinion was always pretty much the same, which is, this is not good. I mean, this is not a Beach Boy record. And you've gotta. And that's all Brian heard, I think, is that pressure. And that pressure was, you've gotta, this is not us. This is not a Beach Boy record. When in Brian's mind, this was totally a Beach Boy record.
The combination of doubt and pressure finally forced Wilson to surrender, and Smile was abandoned. The unreleased album immediately entered popular folklore, the lost masterpiece of a troubled genius. Yet its creator's energy was also lost, and the artist who had been the dominant and sometimes sole creative force within the Beach Boys went into a slow retreat.
He had to pull back. He had to withdraw. He was using the music as kind of a fortress, that it was the place, you know, he could put all his energy there. And a lot of that was kind of, I think, dark energy that was coming from the fact that he was losing his fight with trying to hold his, maintain his sanity to a degree, that the demons that had tracked him everywhere inside his head but couldn't get into the music had now gotten into the music.
The other Beach Boys still needed Brian, however, but they decided that they couldn't allow him the total control over their output that he had previously exerted. Contractually obliged to deliver an album in place of Wilson's shelved magnum opus, they quickly released the Smiley Smile LP, which revisited and reworked many of the abandoned songs. Recorded on basic equipment at Brian Wilson's home, the album marked a watershed for the group, with the entire band not only playing the majority of the instrumental parts, but also credited as producers. Yet the critics and the public, expecting so much from the now legendary material, were bitterly disappointed by the rushed and underproduced results, and it continued the band's commercial decline. The Summer of Love and the psychedelic era had changed the face of popular music, and where Smile may have seen the band welcomed by the counterculture, their reputation was further damaged by their failure to perform at the historic Monterey Pop Festival. With the emergence of a new sensibility and heavier, more serious music, the band were left stranded, unsure of their once reliable figurehead and uncertain how to proceed.
The Beach Boys started to disappear, basically. I mean, we had the old baseball team, the New York Yankees, who were a dynasty for many, many years, and then suddenly they stopped winning. And everybody used to ask the question, are the Yankees still in the league? And kind of that's the way the Beach Boys became too. You know, we just even know they're still here somewhere, right? They were kind of like out of the picture. They might have been doing some of their best creative stuff, but DJs definitely in America did not understand it.
As the decade came to a close, the Beach Boys' fortunes continued to decline. Having strained their relationship with Capitol Records in 1967 with a lawsuit for unpaid royalties, the marketing behind their recent releases had been disappointing, and the band began to look for a new label. With the 1968 album Friends, which failed to reach the top 100, their stock hit an all-time low, and even though Brian Wilson was still contributing strongly to the material and the production, they lacked a clear sense of direction. Unable to see any promise in the future, they looked to the past for salvation.
Because Friends had tanked so terribly in the United States. I think it hit number 126 on the Billboard Hot 100. You know, they kind of like scrambled, and they said, well, let's go back and do some basic Beach Boys sound. And this might have broken Brian's heart a little bit, but he went and he did a full-on version of it.
That single was Do It Again, and despite its nostalgia, the song's return to roots approach proved very current.
It's automatic when I talk with old friends. A conversation turns to girls we knew when their hair was soft and long, and the beach was the place to go.
I think Do It Again does fit into a general trend that is, you could argue, reactionary and nostalgic. In other words, pop music went so far out in 66, 67. You know, by the end of 67, you know, there's a sort of meltdown of structure and form. And I think there was almost in the sense of the kind of Jungian collective unconscious, there was a need to rein it back in. You know, suddenly there was a sort of hankering for the form and precision of the classic 3-minute pop or rock and roll single. You know, let's get back to basics, I suppose. You know, the Beatles with Lady Madonna is an obvious example. And the Stones reacting to the relative disaster of their Satanic Majesties by getting back to the sort of gritty blues bass that they'd started with, you know, Jumpin' Jack Flash. And in the same way, Do It Again is a statement, literally in the lyric and the arrangement and production. It's a statement that we're getting back to basics. We're going to do it again.
The lyrics tell one story, but then there's stuff going on in the music that are just sort of like of the now in 1968. And it wasn't like even the boomers, the baby boomers or people that age didn't have their moments of nostalgia too. And the thing is, the songs, you know, whatever the lyrics say, the song sounds so cool, like that very wickedly cool sort of compressed drum sound that runs through it, that sort of announces the start of the song. It's a very distinctive, very cool sound that does not occur on any other song. It's just in that song.
The distinctive production techniques were the brainchild of young engineer Stephen Desper, whose creative input would become essential to the band's growth in the following decade.
I came up with the sound for Do It Again, the drum sound at the beginning of Do It Again. It's a series of delays. They all went to lunch, and I worked this sound out, and I played it for them when they came back, saying, you know, this is pretty neat sound. It could be, and they liked it. And that pretty much was the point in time where they decided that I would be their mixer.
The single saw the band return to their former chart glory, taking the Beach Boys back into the US Top 20 and hitting the #1 spot in the UK. If their aim had been to recapture their old style and increase their appeal, then they had succeeded. But it provided no clear roadmap for progression. And as they prepared to compile a final album for Capitol, Brian Wilson's commitment to the band was wavering and his mental state deteriorating. Where rudimentary recording equipment had been set up in his Bel Air house for sessions on all of the post-Smile albums, it was now decided that this should be developed into a fully functioning studio.
The home studio came about to entice Brian to become more involved in recording, because at that time he was ill and he was falling into depression more and more, and it was taking him and his creative talents away from what needed to be done. Decisions have to be made from a business point of view as well as an artistic point of view. And it became very important to get Brian involved. So management and the Beach Boys made the decision that they would, with Marilyn, with her cooperation, would convert his informal living room, which had very high ceilings, soundproof it, and make it into a studio. And within about a week, we were in business. As far as actually being involved in the physical creation of the studio, Brian wasn't involved in that. His wife was, because it was really her house that she was giving up, and her privacy. But Brian came down one day and he wanted to paint everything. I thought he was going to paint it like a beige or something, but he came in and it turned out to be bright red here and bright green there and blue here, and it was very stimulating. The colors were stimulating. They weren't aesthetic so much, but it was a fun place to be in.
For Brian Wilson, the studio didn't prove to be so enticing. Instead of working on new compositions, he remained confined to his bedroom, listening to the Ronettes' Be My Baby on repeat, and recorded endless versions of the showboat musical number Old Man River. Not only had he lost his enthusiasm, the partial hearing he had suffered in his right ear since his youth was also now proving an obstacle in approaching modern recording techniques.
With the introduction of the Beach Boys going into stereo, Brian was kind of lost. For Brian to listen to the stereo, he told me what he would hear would be a double sound always, and it threw him off. So in order to get away from that, he had a single loudspeaker in the studio. And many times he would come in and make judgment calls that were right on. Even though he wasn't hearing it like we were, his judgment was right on.
Yet Capitol expected Brian Wilson's full involvement with Beach Boys' product, and as their main songwriter and producer retreated, it was up to other band members to step in and take the helm.
There was a lot of pressure on Brian from the record company, give us a hit, and you know, you don't turn that on and off like a faucet. And so Brian, he's a sensitive guy, and he had a hard time with all this pressure. And his approach was to stay away. And during this time, he was unavailable. The record company is calling, hey, we've given you advances, come on, let's go, get in the studio, do something. All right, so Carl took over as a leader. And not only because he volunteered, but because he was the closest to Brian. And even though Brian wasn't directly involved, he was indirectly involved with production through his brother, Carl.
Upon its release in February 1969, the songs that comprised the album 2020 heralded a new era for the Beach Boys, with Carl Wilson overseeing production and brother Dennis contributing significantly as a songwriter. Their final collection for Capitol Records, although it still failed to ignite the charts in the US, it was a major hit in Europe, boosted by the success of the album's second single, Carl's arrangement of the Phil Spector classic, I Can Hear Music.
This is the way I always dreamed it would be, the way that it is. Oh, when you are holding me, I never had a love of my own. Maybe that's why when we're all alone, I can hear music. I can hear music.
Carl, at that point, was the Beach Boy who had the most invested in kind of taking Brian's achievements forward so that it didn't just all kind of peter out. His first production, the first track where Carl kind of takes control, I Can Hear Music, is still, I think, an example of sort of regressiveness. It's Carl emulating Brian, emulating Phil Spector. So in that sense, it's kind of playing it safe. But I think there's more than enough evidence as time goes on that Carl holds things together. I mean, just in terms of his personality, in terms of the fact that he was, you know, the best singer by far, and that he cared.
Despite the accomplishments of the other band members, Capitol was still expecting a wealth of new Brian Wilson songs. Alongside Do It Again were the older, aptly titled compositions Time to Get Alone and I Went to Sleep. But with the once prolific songwriter unwilling or unable to contribute fresh material, it was finally decided that the Smile Vault should be reopened.
What was left? Well, there was all the stuff Brian had been working on that nobody knew how it went together. Only Brian did, and he wasn't saying. So Carl would bring the tapes into the studio, and we would listen to them, and I made copies of everything, and a game plan would come together, and we would splice things together and figure it out. As far as Cabanescence was pretty far along the way, as My Prayer was quite well recorded. We sweetened it, as it's called. We thickened it up, added some parts. Cabanescence was finished, some more or less with Brian's guidance through Carl. But as Carl would say, you gotta work with what you got.
Welcomes the time for a change.
2020 was lacking in Brian's personal involvement to a great degree, but he had left so many cool things in the can that it wasn't going to be hard to pull some great music, especially counterculture music with Cabanescence, you know, which was one of those great Smile, Van Dyke Parks, Brian Wilson songs. And that particular song made the group a bit relevant. I remember reading some underground magazines, late '69, some rap magazine from Detroit, saying, well, the Beach Boys have something going on here, because look, they got this song Cabanescence, and that's some real stuff. Anything that was going to leak from Smile, even if people didn't know it was from Smile, still worked and still communicated to the growing Woodstock audience.
The astonishing thing was you could put a Smile track on the back of an album and it would blow your mind. Like, where did this come from? You know, what is this? Because it sounds so distinct from, you know, in any year you released it, it sounded fresh and new, because even though it had been recorded years earlier, it was recorded in a style that no one had ever worked in and continued to not work in. These songs were sort of like of no time. They were out of the sort of cultural continuum of what you expected.
Shortly after the album's release, the Beach Boys once again issued a lawsuit against Capitol. And with only one more single owed to the label, the band and their management focused their attention on attracting new record companies. Yet in May, just before signing a lucrative deal with the European label Deutsche Grammophon, the reclusive Brian Wilson emerged at a press conference, declaring that the band were facing bankruptcy.
He didn't want to have to go back to work, which was essentially what all these contracts were calling him to do. You know, by then he'd had enough. And I mean, and he could read and understand when they told him, like, you will be responsible for, like, X percentage of these albums. And I think there were contractual obligations. Brian Wilson will write and produce X percent of the songs. He had become the provider, not just for his immediate family, but for his extended family, you know, for his cousins, and for their friends, and for their lawyers and colleagues. Everybody's invested in Brian continuing to work and be Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. But the only guy that didn't want that to happen was Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys.
As the band headed out to Europe for a successful tour in territories where they were still big business, the reluctant Brian Wilson was nevertheless cajoled into working on the final Capitol single by his father, Murray. This domineering figure, who'd exerted so much pressure on his children during the early stages of their career when he oversaw their business affairs, was a presence that Brian had long since attempted to avoid. Yet convincing his son that the band needed a hit before moving on from Capitol, together they composed Breakaway.
Time will not wait for me. Time is my destiny. Why change the part of me that has to be free? The love that passed me by, I found no reason why. But now each day is built
mixed it and played with it. And I mixed it a lot, and I came very familiar with the song. And I played it a lot, and Brian would hear it, because his bedroom was above the studio, and he would hear it. And eventually it came down, and eventually started working with it, and he worked with it a lot. He was never satisfied with it. It seemed like he was always changing and erasing this or adding that. Eventually it came out, but even after it came out, he was still working with it. And he just loved that song.
Wilson's efforts went unnoticed by domestic audiences, however, and the single failed to break the Billboard Top 40 and to raise their profile. In Europe, the band were playing packed venues in front of an audience who truly appreciated the post-Smile material. But at home, the Beach Boys had lost their appeal. Desperate to improve the situation, the band contacted their old concert promoter, Fred Vail, to help them reconnect with their lost audience.
Carl called me and he said, we're making some management changes out here. He said, your name came up and we'd love to have you consider rejoining the organization. Because it was a tough time for the Beach Boys. All was not great. All was not, you know, what it had been. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. And it really was. Brian, he was taking a little bit of a backseat, but he was also becoming much more reclusive. So when I finally come back out, and it's June of 1969, you know, there is a little bit of a change in Brian. He's more withdrawn and a little bit more, I honestly felt he was a little bit more insecure. You know, greed and the money versus personal ambition and personal passion and wanting to move on. It was, you know, the perfect storm.
With Wilson's link to his muse severed by the financial concerns of the Beach Boys, his more ambitious and less commercial interests found an outlet elsewhere. Young poet Stephen Kalanick, who had been signed to Brother Records back in 1967, had since become close to the Wilson family, and with the band busy touring, Brian developed a new project with this writer. With the home studio at hand for these experiments, they began recording Kalanick's spoken word poetry, with Wilson's original compositions and backing vocals.
I think that Brian wanted to do alternative things. I also think, and I don't mean this unkindly because I've become friends with all of them, I think that there probably was pressure to stay with commercial kind of Beach Boy things, and I probably was not an artist that was very commercial. But I think he was genuinely stirred and moved. We never talked about a hit or any, I mean, obviously this is not the kind of thing, but we were excited with the galactic poems, with the symphonies, with America, and doing things, and it was such a joyful experience.
America, I know you. I feel your open spirit. I roam in your open meadows. I taste the oranges from your orange tree. I smell the blossoms of your pear. America, I feel you. I feel your restless spirit as a part of myself. I see you in your snow-capped mountains that like a child's finger touch the sky. America, I know you. Far away from smog and cities full of grime. America, I know your open air and open fields. I fly into your arms.
There's so much about this time. Precious, dear, Brian not thinking commercially, being artistic, being spiritual, being open to life, almost recognizing that whatever we were doing felt like a gift. He helped me organize it, weed out what didn't need to be there. He was an active part in this thing. And he gave me the support. And we did it together. When Brian sang Lonely Man in the studio with that high falsetto, and let me tell you of a lonely man, and he got me to go my natural voice. who lived, it sounds like the Middle Ages to me, or the Renaissance. And he did those high notes, and a lot of it's cut out, the way they mixed it down. My God, like I get chills in my body. Are you an egomaniac? No, it's almost like we didn't write it.
Let me tell you of a lonely man who lived many, many years ago. And he searched for a love in a distant land, and he didn't know where to go.
Lonely man, he searched here and there and everywhere. It's kind of like Brian, the love he could not find. He searched in Canada and Spain and in Italy, around Gibraltar near the Red Sea, and the love was there, was everywhere, and the love he did not see. It was in the flower in the meadow, the brook running by the sea, the apple in the orchard, the cherry on the tree. You know, I mean, the lonely man is no longer, and the heavens they did open, the light came shining down, and there's no longer any lonely man around. He was excited. He liked listening to me recite. He was so into it. He was calling everybody, the heads of record companies, Mo Austin, to try and help me get a placement. He had a real passion for it, and I think he went with his own gut, and probably did not get much support.
Unable to generate any interest in the project, it was eventually abandoned, resurfacing decades later. Yet at a time when he was without a clear sense of purpose, these experiments highlighted that as an outsider in his own band, the composer still needed others for inspiration and encouragement.
I think Brian artistically hungered for a quantum leap of spirituality, that because sometimes all the material success and people loving you, if you don't feel right within yourself, I think Brian was still searching for the road to himself.
I think he was wanting to feel needed, wanting to feel appreciated, wanting to know that what he was doing had purpose. Brian would call me up at 10, 11 o'clock. Fred, what are you doing? Oh, I'm watching TV, getting ready to go to bed. Oh, I got a song, I want to run it by you, you know. And come on out, you know, there's nobody here. I want to play it for you. I want your response, want your reaction, you know, want your input, whatever. So I'd hop in the car and drive out to Bel Air, which was, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes or so away. And Brian would talk and play me some songs, and then just kind of just fiddle around, and you know, and all of a sudden it'd be 2 o'clock in the morning, and Brian had gotten up at 4 or 5, and you know, he was just, you know, reaching his peak, you know, and I've been up since 7 o'clock in the morning, you know, and I knew I'd have to be up in the next morning at 7, and you know, by the time I finally would say, well, Brian, I gotta get home, I gotta get some sleep, and I got a lot on my plate tomorrow, and you know, I didn't want to leave him, but at the same time, I was, you know, a couple nights I was exhausted.
Yet these compositions that Brian had been working on would form a major part of the Beach Boys' next release. At the end of November 1969, after struggling to find a suitable deal, the band eventually signed to Reprise Records, a subsidiary of Warner Brothers. Immediately after negotiations were complete, they performed a short North American tour, and in keeping with their recent domestic fortunes, it was dismally attended. Yet the band were excited about their new label, had begun working on a clutch of new songs, and Brian himself got caught up in the enthusiasm surrounding him. Unable to shake off their outdated image while on Capitol, with their first Warner's release, the band knew that expectations were running high, and that they had to move into the new decade as a reinvigorated unit.
I was keenly aware of the importance of this album. The Beach Boys are looked at as the establishment. I mean, they're still looked at as that group that wear the white pants and the striped shirt. Even though they weren't wearing white pants and striped shirt, they were still considered the band of the establishment, and they're going up against a counterculture. And it was basically a little bit of a battle, so to speak. You know, do they continue to pump out the very establishment, very commercial hits that they had, you know, 63 to 67, or do they go forward? Do they start to take on new musical challenges, reinvent themselves, so to speak?
It was a time of growth, a time of evolution for the Beach Boys. It was a very creative time, and Brian was right in there too. All the experimenting, the fact that they were coming into their own as musicians and as writers, the whole thing blossomed.
Not only did the new sessions see an increase in Brian Wilson's contribution in terms of songwriting, it also saw him step back into a more hands-on production role.
Working with Brian was exhausting because Brian was fast. It was all I could do to keep up with Brian. I was amazed at how few takes Brian used for himself or others. He was a 1 or 2 takes and that was it. And that was all he needed. He was so good at singing. He didn't need to keep doing it over and over and punch in and everything. But he would do that with other people if necessary, especially instrumental tracks to get it right. But if he was adding a part, if he was playing a guitar, if he was playing the organ or something, 1 or 2 takes was all he needed.
A finished album was quickly delivered to Warner Reprise, yet despite Brian's increased presence, the label were unable to hear clear hits and insisted that the band return to the studio to strengthen the record. One song, however, a composition by Wilson and Mike Love, did strike them as strongly commercial. Add Some Music to Your Day was rush-released in late February 1970 as a taster for the forthcoming album. But for all the high hopes of everyone involved that this would secure them a return to the top flight, the single underperformed.
I don't think the media was too gung-ho on the record because there were so many outside artists and the whole era, the whole counterculture thing, they were up against that, and it was a very, very difficult task.
It's kind of interesting as to why the song Add Some Music was originally going to be the Sunflower album title. I mean, everybody really, really believed in this particular song. At the same time, this is a period where lyrics are the most important thing in a song. And, the lyrics are nice, too nice. It's just, it becomes a bit saccharine. Anybody who had long hair down to their shoulders and a beard and is thinking about stopping the draft in the Vietnam War is thinking that's dentist office music. So what I don't understand is these guys who are running Warner Brothers Records at the time, who are managing the Jimi Hendrix Experience and the Grateful Dead and all these other groups, thinking that that was going to be such a big deal. And maybe Brian Wilson believed in that as being a big deal. And maybe he didn't recognize what was going on. The kind of song that had lyrics that might have communicated at that time was This Whole World, which Brian had written. It's About Time, which Dennis had written. These are sentiments the Beach Boys are expressing, the same sentiments the counterculture was expressing.
I'm thinking about this whole world. Late at night, I think about the love of this whole world. Lots of different people everywhere. And when I go anywhere, I see love, I see love, I see love.
This Whole World is a good example of a really solid Brian Wilson song that would be good in any period by any standard. This Whole World is also a good example of him really experimenting with keys in a way that he did much earlier, like in Pet Sounds and other things. It starts in C. And now somehow we're in A. Now we get to C sharp or D flat, and then we get a descending bass. Now we're in B flat. And we're back in C. Somehow we got from C to A to D flat to B flat and finally back to C. If I play the keys like that, they sound like they don't belong together, like you couldn't actually make a song that uses those keys and sounds coherent. But as always, the way he gets from one to the other is just masterful.
That Wilson was back on form was seemingly confirmed by the clutch of other songs that he contributed to the album. And on the surface, Sunflower promised a new period of productivity from a reinvigorated artist.
You have a sense that this guy is back at work. I mean, certainly if you view it through the limited lens of what seemed to be going on in 1970, you could pick up that album and you would think to yourself, Brian Wilson is back on, is back on the ball. It's a different band, it's a new era, but Brian is definitely first among equals here. And that's a very heartening thing to think in 1970. And people, certainly critics and people who were hip to that kind of sound, or into that kind of music at the time were overjoyed because it was and remains a really, really good album.
Brian, to a degree, was back, but he never was back 100% because they'd all taken on new roles, both in songwriting, both in conceptual ideas, in the studio, in the control room, behind the desk. I mean, the whole thing had changed. It was no longer 1963, 1966. It was a whole different era.
In keeping with these new roles, when at the close of the sessions, Carl Wilson and engineer Stephen Desper went back to the Smile vaults to salvage the track Cool, Cool Water, Brian was barely involved. Yet the other band members were key in building and redeveloping the track.
Carl conferred with Brian as to how to put the song together. And to some extent, Brian had an idea, but he hadn't really finished it in his mind. Then the Beach Boys themselves, including Alan and Bruce and Michael and Carl, all contributed ideas that built on Brian's foundation and built up the song that eventually got released on Sunflower.
When the heat's got you down, here's what you ought to do. Get yourself in that cool, cool water now. Get yourself in that cool, cool water.
Brian's contribution was basically at the beginning in the Smile sessions. He did come down and sing some parts, mostly parts with Carl, sang a little fugue area with Carl. But it was a lot of hard work.
Issued in August 1970, Sunflower was perhaps the band's most coherent and exceptional album since Pet Sounds. A confident step into a brave new world with all members contributing strongly. Yet despite glowing reviews, upon its release it was the Beach Boys' biggest commercial disappointment to date.
It was like the world had passed them by. I was calling promoters who had made hundreds of thousands of dollars off the Beach Boys and they wouldn't return my calls. I mean, this was, to me, it was, I just couldn't believe it. I was hurt, I was deeply hurt because I knew the boys were still a great band and it was just a bomb. That album was only on the charts 4 weeks. It only made it to 151 on the national charts. It was a dismal failure. So a lot of, disappointment, a lot of head scratching, a lot of doubt about their future, a lot of finger pointing. They were still the same Beach Boys and really not necessarily at their creative peak, but certainly at one of their most creative eras or periods. So it was pretty disheartening.
They had to decide, were they going to break the band up and each member go their own way, including Brian? Or were they going to stick together and continue along those lines. They decided to stay together.
Despite the bitter blow of Sunflower, the Beach Boys pressed on, determined to make their voice heard in a changing America. Ditching their previous management, they installed young DJ Jack Riley to oversee their affairs, and he immediately brought a fresh insight into how they could become relevant again. In October 1970, they played the Big Sur Festival, reconnecting with the countercultural audience and earning strong reviews. In November, the band played 4 shows at the most iconic club on the Sunset Strip, the Whiskey A Go-Go, the former stomping ground of the Doors and Frank Zappa. The key draw was the appearance of one Brian Wilson, who Riley had convinced to return to the live arena. Yet the ailing composer left the stage on the second night and didn't return for any further performances. The tide seemed to be turning, however, and in 1971 the Beach Boys continued to raise their profile with concerts at New York's Carnegie Hall and Central Park, and at the Fillmore East alongside the godfathers of the counterculture, the Grateful Dead. At the same time, the band returned to the studio, fueled by positive press and Riley's guidance, and keen to keep developing their sound. Brian Wilson, however, was no longer so prepared to contribute. Leaning more heavily on a variety of drugs and isolating himself in his bedroom, he shared none of the drive propelling his bandmates onward.
The whole group, and including Brian Wilson, had their heart inside of the Sunflower album. And Brian, I think, put a lot of great effort into that record, because no matter what anybody says, you just hear Brian's voice all over that thing. The Angel is singing everywhere, all over that album. He's got great vocal arrangements on that. And some great Brian Wilson originals, but also he's sharing work with his brothers too. And it's all cohesive. And then that just like goes nowhere. That had to break Brian Wilson's heart and had to make him feel, what do I have to do?
The way I would have handled Brian would have been to hire a studio, fill it full of musicians, transport Brian into the studio and just let him alone. And just let him alone. Let him do whatever he wanted to do. Eventually you'd get something, I think. But they tried to micromanage him a lot, not the Beach Boys so much as it was the management. But you had all these factors. You had the whole band is now coming into their own. And of course his involvement with drugs didn't help the situation. So it perhaps wasn't exactly the best time for Brian all around.
And this was strongly reflected in the original songs he brought to the sessions. Unlike his Sunflower compositions, Wilson himself had provided the lyrics to these new pieces, and they clearly indicated his tortured psyche. If his developing tendency to walk around in his bedclothes and to self-destructively consume drugs and fast food didn't highlight his clinical depression strongly enough, these new works underlined it. A Day in the Life of a Tree, co-written with manager Jack Riley, was Wilson's greatest departure so far from the surf, cars and girls image that he had been fleeing since 1965. With the band uninterested in this new oddity, Wilson persuaded Riley himself to provide the lead vocal and called in Smile partner Van Dyke Parks to add further touches.
That was a big creative song for Brian. We had a lot of discussions about that song, he and I did. The group at that point in time didn't understand this Day in the Life of the Tree, bringing the maid in to sing Spanish, having Jack Riley and Van Dyke Parks and all of them. In hindsight, perhaps this was Brian sort of saying, I want to produce other people, not the band, because he definitely was. But for me, it was a great song because I saw the internal visualization that you would get from hearing the song. And now how could I contribute to making that happen? Because Brian had this whole idea of a tree aging and telling a microcosm of life through a tree. And the story unfolded, and Brian was quite involved in that.
My sap was rich and I was strong.
The central image is a tree that's being killed by pollution, and it ends with this beautiful, richly harmonized kind of coda that revolves around the word, or the phrase, trees like me weren't meant to live if all this world can give is pollution and slow death. Which, on the one hand, yes, that parses as a song about the environment, but on the other hand, it's also a song about a guy, creative guy, working in a toxic environment.
Trees like me weren't meant to live if all this world can give pollution and slow death.
Brian clearly is in a very, very bad state, and we know that now. We also know that people just didn't know what to do about guys who were in that sort of state. This is still very early days in terms of knowledge about addiction, depression, mental problems. You know, there are a lot of damaged people already by this relatively young point in the rock and roll story, and yet people aren't going to rehab. People are just being left to flounder. Nobody really knows what to do. Should one sort of blame people in the Beach Boys camp for not doing more to help Brian at that point? It's difficult to say. You know, is Brian flagging up his trauma and extremely depressed state of mind in songs like A Day in the Life of Tree? Yeah, but he probably doesn't even know he's doing it himself in some senses. That song could be heard in the context of their growing eco-awareness. And therefore, I don't think when I heard that track as a sort of teenager, it wouldn't have occurred to me that it was a cry from the heart. So it might not have occurred to Mike Love or Al Jardine, you know. I think that, so you probably have to say that.
But if the anguish of this track was hidden by its imagery, his other major contribution to the album, Till I Die, was more transparent. Written during the Sunflower Sessions, its forlorn despair proved too much for some of his bandmates.
He brought it in, and it was counterintuitively beautiful and lovely and brings light into the world, even as it describes a world without light. Yeah, it's a neat trick if you can do it. And, you know, Mike Love's reaction was it wasn't positive enough, and he wanted him to change the lyrics, which Brian tried to do, and they actually performed, and I've heard the song, and it's ridiculous. You know, he's saying it's like the capping lines of every, you know, instead of like these sort of perfectly rendered images of somebody sinking and vanishing, have been replaced by, you know, the ocean doesn't suck you up. It holds me up, he says. It's like completely contradicting the spirit, the sound and the spirit and the nature of his message. But fortunately, Brian and whoever else who had the backbone said, that doesn't work at all. We're never going to do that. We're going to go back to the original version. And, you know, and it, you know, it worked beautifully.
I'm a cork on the ocean, floating over the raging sea. How deep is the ocean? How deep is the ocean? I lost my way.
That's probably one of the strongest commentaries on his state of mind at that time. I'm a cork on the ocean, just words of despair. And musically, I think it supports that too, because you get these chords that just don't go anywhere. It just, the tonality floats back and forth just like this cork on the ocean. These are just a bunch of chords. We don't know what key we're in yet. Then finally, we get a little more sense of key, but then we're right back to this. This goes on for a while through 3 verses, matching again this idea that's in the lyric. Then finally at the end, it says, these things I'll be until I die. And then at that point, you get a really strong sense of key. It finally does anchor itself. There's this sense of arrival, this sense of stability that you have only when I die.
If you're a creative person and you're working from your heart of hearts, how could how could it be tolerable to work with somebody who's telling you that what you're saying and what you're feeling isn't commercial enough? You're not in a mood to do that. That's not how artists work. They work in the opposite way. They work with, what they feel and what they're thinking becomes commercial because they say it in a way that's unique and beautiful. And to tell somebody that your unique and beautiful work isn't going to be on the charts, so you got to change it. It's like, especially if you're a fragile type of creative person like Brian, you're like, you know what? I'm out of here. Like, this just is not working for me. And yet when you get yourself into a position where you're painted up against the wall like that, there's nowhere to go except to disappear. So Brian's choice, I think a self-preservational choice was to say, I'm done.
Yet he would be involved one final time with the album. Only 2 months before it was due for release, the band again returned to the Smile Vaults, resurrecting a track that was already known to some fans. Wilson had first aired Surf's Up on a CBS special, Inside Pop, The Rock Revolution, broadcast in early 1967, and this legendary performance had left the Beach Boys community eagerly awaiting a complete version.
The glass was raised to fire, it rose the fullness of the wine, the dim last toast.
Wilson had shelved the track in an unfinished state, yet incomplete recordings remained, and together Carl Wilson and Stephen Desper began piecing the various elements together.
This was a very special song, also a song that carried with it a mystique. Brian was afraid of the song. He didn't want any part of it. He didn't even want it finished until they began working with it. It was, I think, part of the Smile area where the fire was in the across the street, and there was a stigma attached to it. And we would work on the song and hear Brian get in his car and leave. That was how much he was afraid of it.
Surf's up, board a tidal wave. Come about hard and join the young, and off in spring you gave. I heard the word.
He overcame it at the end. Brian could hear all the things that were going on in the studio. You could hear him through the floor because his bedroom was above the studio. Once in a while, he would come down and say, no, you can't, no, it's got to be this way. And then it would take a whole new direction. Everything would stop. Brian was in the studio. Everything would stop, and it would all take a new direction.
Surf's Up became the title track of the album, and combined with Jack Riley's impressive campaign to modernize the band, the song's inclusion helped the Beach Boys achieve their greatest commercial success in years. Yet if Brian Wilson's original compositions on the album suggested a broken man, he was in fact far from a spent force. As the group celebrated their return to the US Top 30, he focused his attention on other projects. Since the sessions for Sunflower, Wilson had been sporadically spending time and composing material with the young musician David Sandler, who had been introduced to him by bandmate Bruce Johnston. He was also looking for the right opportunity to work again with his wife Marilyn and her sister Diane Revell, who he'd previously composed material for and produced as part of the girl group The Honeys in the early 60s. While the other Beach Boys had focused on the Surf's Up album, he decided to combine both of these outside projects, and Sandler was called in to begin work alongside Wilson as co-producer and songwriter for a new band, Spring, with Marilyn and Diane on vocals and Stephen Desper behind the desk.
I just think that he needed to sort of stretch his legs a little bit. I think his calling me and wanting to produce something that was not a Beach Boy project would be an example of that. Brian was definitely a person who would try things. It was amazing how little resistance there was between him and something new.
Brian was happy to have an outlet, a creative outlet. The idea was to do it inexpensively by using old tracks that were borrowed from the Beach Boys and then adding to them. The studio was there, the engineer was there, You just as well use it.
I think that he was searching. You know, he said, I've done this, and I'd like to take a look at all this and see what the next step is, or if there is a next step.
I love it when you talk to me. I love it when you talk to me. But you're
Convinced this was the next step, as well as recording a clutch of familiar cover versions, Wilson also began working on new material with Sandler. This was a notable collaboration, because unlike Mike Love or Van Dyke Parks, the young songwriter was first and foremost a musician rather than a lyricist.
He'd be playing, and then he'd get up, and I'd sit down and play. So yeah, there was that, you know, two people were basically musically oriented. And when I was writing at that time, I'd riff, and I'd get a riff going, and then I'd get a melody and words to go with it. I think there was a burst of energy in it. An album can be a place where chemistry takes place, and it's inexplicable, it's an intangible. People come together, and they don't even know it's happening. It's just taking place, and it happens over time. And then at some point during the process, they say, hey, you know, something's happening here. That was definitely, I think, an experience for Brian in the midst of his reassessments.
I'm looking up. Do you see? I see the sky. Tell me why. I look and wonder what when will I see you standing there?
Creatively, Spring was where Brian got to do his own thing. He did only 4 songs on that. He did Sweet Mountain and, you know, Tennessee Waltz and a few other things, you know. But Desper had a great hand in creating that album too, and David Sandler too. That's a collaboration, but it also gives Brian the chance to feel his way through new kinds of sounds and new kind of things, you know. Spring is one of his great moments. You know, he actually is a member of the Spring group. He's the third voice. Ginger Blake is no longer part of the Honeys. It's Diane Rovell and Marilyn Wilson. Brian Wilson's the third voice. And on 4 tracks, a production element.
Keep looking up.
He was thirsty for some kind of inspiration. Maybe it was Spring, maybe it wasn't. And, you know, he'd done the Beach Boy thing for 6 or 7 years, and they were touring, and, you know, it was a business. So I think he just wanted something to inspire him. And I was always worried that when I worked with him that, you know, that I would be seen as somehow taking him away from what was for them bread and butter, you know. So I just try to keep my distance from anything that had to do with his relationship with them.
I don't think it was a big enough endeavor for Brian. Brian needed to form his own band, is what he needed to do. He wasn't in charge anymore, so maybe that was more of a psychological weight for him to bear than we all realized at the time. And in hindsight, wonderful thing, hindsight, but maybe it would have been best for the Beach Boys to break up. Who knows?
By the time the album was released to little fanfare in July 1972, Wilson's other band also had a new LP completed and in the stores. With a recently purchased recording venue at their disposal, Brother Studios in Santa Monica, the Beach Boys had worked for the first time at a real distance from Brian. Carl Wilson still at the helm, they strengthened their sound with new recruits Blondie Chaplin and Ricky Fattar, and by early 1972 had completed a new collection of material. Yet after the positive performance of Surf's Up, Carl and the Passions' So Tough failed to connect with either the public or critics.
I tend to think that Carl and the Passions is rather underrated. It's generally sort of slagged off. over the years. But I think the Beach Boys at this point are coming together as a sort of cohesive ensemble in a new way, directed by Carl, augmenting the lineup with Blondie and Ricky, and I think it kind of works. I think it's as close as the Beach Boys came to being a kind of Californian rock band. We all spend so much time sort of lamenting the decline of Brian's genius that we tend to miss the upside of that, which is that the others do, you know, come out of the woodwork and produce work that's maybe not as great as Pet sounds, but it's credible.
Brian Wilson was involved as a songwriter on 2 tracks, however. You Need a Mess of Help to Stand Alone and Marcella. Yet as a performer, he was all but absent.
There's enough of him there where you can kind of sense his presence, but in an equally unexpected is the fact that a lot of the other songs on the album are better, maybe, or more, or are just as good. Let's put it that way.
I don't think You Need a Mess of Help Standalone stands out particularly as a Brian composition. I mean, if you compare Carl and the Passions to Surf's Up, some of the peak moments on Surf's Up definitely are the Brian Wilson tracks. Surf's Up itself, of course, Until I Die. I mean, those are the peaks of that album. I don't think on Carl and the Passions you can say the same thing.
Yet understanding that the reclusive composer was still the main draw for the band's fan base, Warner's not only chose both of Wilson's compositions as singles, but also ensured that despite his disinterest, he still appeared to be a member of the group.
The photo on the cover of Carl and the Passions is striking for a few reasons. First of them, the addition of Ricky Fataar and Blondie Chaplin, South African musicians who Carl had really developed a deep relationship with and had them join the Beach Boys. And they brought a whole new, and I think in many ways, a very welcome addition to the sound, because they were both good performers, they good musicians, and they kind of added some grit to the Beach Boys sound. So you have that, and then you also have Brian, who seems to be there, but actually has been very craftily edited into this photograph that is actually an image of him from a completely different place and time. They have to find an artificial way to reintroduce him into the community.
And that community still wanted Brian Wilson to play a more active role in their music. In June 1972, the Beach Boys headed for Holland to begin working on their next album. A radical relocation of their studio enabled them to write and record in a new environment, one which the band hoped would fuel their inspiration. Yet as they tried to coax Wilson out of his isolation to join them, he had already found inspiration elsewhere. Randy Newman was a new breed of singer-songwriter, a piano-based performer and composer with major critical appeal, and his 1972 album Sail Away reignited Wilson's interest in contemporary music.
He hadn't really come out vocally about any rock and roll for a long time, since Rubber Soul, which is like December of 1965. And here it is 1972, and he embraces Randy Newman's Sail Away. Well, why is he even opening his ears to that? Because people he knew and people he was involved with were making that record. You got Russ Heidelman, Lenny Warnaker, who was tight with Van Dyke Parks. Van Dyke was, very involved with Randy Newman's career at Warner Brothers. So he hears about it because his friends are into it, and Randy Newman was obviously an incredibly skilled songwriter and a piano-based songwriter, right? And the kind of sound that's on that record, Brian gets it. It just makes total sense to him.
In America, you get food to eat. You won't have to run through the jungle and scuff up your feet. You just sing about Jesus and drink wine all day. It's great to be an American.
Well, it's a very disconsolate album in a lot of ways. It's very dark, and it has the feel of a circus sideshow. You know, and also this weird sort of old homey feel to the title track, which is a hugely ugly recitation by a slaver, you know, spinning these fairy tales for these, you know, for the enslaved people being shipped off to the U.S., you know, and how everything's going to be perfect for them when you know everything's going to be hell for them, you know, and would continue to be thus, not just through slavery, but also through the terrible, you know, segregated years and, you know, and even now to a degree.
In America, every man is free to take care of his home and his family. You be as happy as a monkey in a monkey tree. You're all gonna be an American. Sail away. Sail away. We will cross the mighty ocean into Charleston Bay. Sail away.
To my mind, Brian's connection to that album, and it was a deep and abiding connection, was, you know, it sort of resonates to the core of his tragedy. That he could identify with this godless world that Randy Newman was describing. I think by the time that they were getting ready to record Holland, I mean, he was feeling thoroughly and utterly bereft of light. The other guys in the band and his wife and the kids had all shipped off to Holland, and he's sitting there and he's supposed to fly out, and he ain't going, and he ain't going, and what he's doing is that he's staying home listening to Sail Away.
When Wilson did finally cross the Atlantic and contribute to the album, the major composition he laboured on showed little of Newman's influence. The epic musical fantasy Mount Vernon and Fairway seemed to rise from the same creative impulse that had forged A Day in the Life of a Tree, and again the other band members were baffled. In January 1973, the result of the Beach Boys' European experiment was issued, the LP Holland, and it was decided that Brian Wilson's lengthy Anomaly was simply too incongruous to fit on the album. It was instead included as a bonus EP.
Musically, it's fantastic. It's strange. It's got a lot of spoken word pieces in it, which again are voiced by Jack Riley. But also, again, speaking from the heart, from the essence of his soul about his experience with music. And it's all about, you know, because that Mount Vernon and Fairway is a direct reference to the street corner outside the teenaged Mike Love's house, where he and Brian would sit up and sing, you know, harmonize on songs like in cars outside the house. And so I think at that point, you know, he was definitely ready to kind of not only romanticize the beauty of that, but then also delve into, you know, that there was always someone not far away ready to take it away from him.
There was a mansion on a hill, but deep in a secret kingdom where a young prince lived. He had 4 sisters and 4 brothers. The prince had a special bedroom on the ground floor with a window that looked down into a deep, deep forest. He could see distant lights from other castles in the kingdom from his window. During the day, he went to school. When it became night, he stayed by himself, usually in his secret, hidden bedroom. One night, while nearly everyone was asleep, he took out of the attic a radio, and he decided to listen to it.
When you bought Holland, you played that EP once probably, and you never played it again, and it just seemed a strange sort of footnote or indulgence. And what did it really mean? I mean, now you kind of look back and it's almost like Brian as Michael Jackson in Neverland or something. It's sort of regressive as a sort of fantasy of his childhood and the magic of the transistor radio and the land to which he travels through hearing this music on the airwaves. So it does seem to sort of hanker for some magical time in his memory that he can't really access anymore. It's pretty sad rather than magical.
Dancing back and forth, the magic transistor started moving down his path. He could hear the sound coming out like nothing he had ever heard before. The trees were getting closer together, and flowers glowed with tinges of magic light as he followed, thinking to himself, what's going on?
It's odd. It was not something that was designed or ever could have been commercially successful. It was very long. I think it would have taken up most of a side of an album, if not the entire side. It was an eccentric work from an eccentric guy describing his eccentric life. So on one level, it's hugely successful. On another level, it can't exist on a rock and roll record in 1973.
And that record, on which the other members of the Beach Boys continued to grow as songwriters and performers, proved a notable success, hitting the US top 40 and remaining in the charts for 7 months.
I don't think Holland is vastly superior to Carl and the Passions, but it probably is a better record, kind of track for track. I think it is definitely an album that suggests maturity, regardless of the agendas of each of them and the internal politics. You know, they do pull together. They take the music seriously. You know, they're not just hacking it. They want to make a great album.
Making it softly, like the evening sea, trying to be, making it go, creating it gently.
Holland is oddly the least Brian Wilson album that they have, and one of my favorites. These are the works of the other Beach Boys to a great degree, to some extent working along the lines of what Brian had created, but to I think a bigger extent, being themselves and writing about their lives and their experiences and using their own distinct sort of sounds and influences. And it was hugely satisfying for a time. I mean, Holland was, in Rolling Stone magazine, I remember, it was just, wonderfully reviewed as one of their better albums.
Yet once again, Warner Reprise had been dissatisfied with the original master when it was delivered. And Sail on Sailor, a track that Van Dyke Parks had composed with Brian Wilson back in May 1972, was resurrected and recorded. It became the album's lead single, and its lyrics showed a strain of optimism absent from Wilson's recent work.
The reason why I think Sail on Sailor is an even more important song for Brian Wilson than Till I Die is the despair and hopelessness and just, I want to get away from it all and out that Till I Die is about, is then a new birth with Sail on Sailor, because I'm going to continue, I'm going to deal. Like the lyrics of Sail on Sailor go on about rebirth and rediscovery and just getting through those hard times and then coming out of it.
Must not blunder, there's no wonder, all I've under. From the lying and the sighing and my crying and my dying. Sail on,
When Brian Wilson did the Smile Tour in 2004, he did Sail on Sailor, and he totally reclaimed the song as he reclaimed the Smile album. And it was kind of an amazing thing for all of us to look around and say, he's actually singing this, and he's saying all the words, and he knows those words, and he feels those words. That's why that's such an important song, because he's going to carry on. This guy outlived Dennis, he outlived Murray, he outlived Carl, he outlived the entire Jimi Hendrix experience who said surf music is dead. Sail on Sailor shows where Brian's personality really was. He was going to survive.
In 1973, however, that was far from obvious. In June, Murray Wilson passed away, and losing the volatile anchor that was both damaging and stabilizing, Brian spiraled out of control. First fleeing to New York and avoiding the funeral, by the end of the month, the composer returned to his Bel Air home and retired to his bed, where he would remain on and off for the next 2 years. Cast adrift from his old band, and without any new projects to focus on, Brian Wilson disappeared from public life. The Beach Boys, on the other hand, were about to see their fortunes change. Popular culture had reached a turning point, and with America exhausted by the disaster of the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, and failed revolutionary politics, a new wave of nostalgia swept across the nation. Heralded by the release of George Lucas's hit film American Graffiti, which painted an idealized romantic image of early 60s youth culture, this collective yearning for a more innocent time hugely benefited the Beach Boys, whose early work exemplified this era. Capitol Records were quick to notice this new trend, and Rush released a cleverly compiled best-of album, Endless Summer, in 1974. A selection of the band's material from 62 to 65, it sold more than 1 million copies and elevated the Beach Boys to a popularity they had hardly known in their heyday.
There's no doubt the compilations were helped by a huge undertow of nostalgia and recycling and return to pre-psychedelic, pre-experimental pop innocence, if you like. You know, it's the days of hot hamburger stands and milkshakes and drive-ins and everything that American Graffiti represented. Very important, and everybody's going back to that. It's certainly not just the Beach Boys. Endless Summer, I suppose ultimately it vindicated the Mike Love camp. It said, you know, come on guys, let's just be pragmatic here. Let's not fuck with the formula. The formula is that the people want those old hits. They want to hear them in the summer fairgrounds, and they want to hear them in the arenas and in the bowls, and that's what they want.
The fact that this Beach Boys early music makes its comeback via the Endless Summer just changes the whole picture. And the band starts to do a set list that basically remained until this day. I think, you know, how does it, the concert starts out with California Girls. It ends with Surfing USA. They come back with Good Vibrations for the encore and Barbara Ann, and finally end with Fun, Fun, Fun. Whoopee, we're home, you know, instead of doing Ride on Cell Block number 9 and Student Demonstration Time, you know. It just becomes a completely different thing. It just changes overnight.
The trajectory that had seen the band free themselves from their past and establish a more modest fan base with the mature sounds of Carl and the Passions and Holland was at an end. Jack Riley was sacked, Blondie Chaplin and Ricky Fattar soon left the band, and the focus was on capitalizing on the new nostalgia audience. In 1975, the band toured relentlessly, while further compilations hit the shelves. Yet the composer who had written the majority of the classics that audiences wanted to hear was nowhere to be seen. By this time, Brian Wilson was a changed man, mentally and now physically, the years of fast food, drugs and inactivity having visibly taken their toll. Finally, in late '75, a radical therapist, Dr. Eugene Landy, was called in to bring Brian Wilson back to the land of the living.
I don't think they were really in a position one way or the other to really want to acknowledge that he had some mental problems. A lot of people, and I think particularly from their background, are very determined to not do that, because at which point you begin to admit something very scary and something that's very stigmatizing. But he was really not well. And in order to try to make him well, that's when his wife Marilyn, a long-suffering wife, by the way, she hired this psychologist, Gene Landy, who was, suspiciously enough, very tied in, to showbiz people. But he had a very strict kind of fascistic style of practice where you just you take these people and you essentially reparent them. And people who have drug habits, people who have antisocial habits, usually these things come together. High-functioning, super successful weirdos that you take and kind of raise into functional creative people. He sort of became the anchor that Brian had with his father in his life, telling him to get up off his ass and do his work. And Brian kind of needs that. And I think that once he developed a little motivation, a little momentum, and sort of the new bounds of his life were sort of created for him, he could work.
By 1976, Wilson was showing signs of improvement under Landy's regime. Not only was he out of bed and exercising, but he was also starting to write songs again at the therapist's insistence. This presented an opportunity for the Beach Boys, as Warner Reprise were desperate to see Brian involved in the band's next album, despite work already completed by the other Wilson brothers.
Dennis And Carl had worked for a full 2 years probably, most days that they had free, working on albums and trying to get the best possible Beach Boy songs that they could. And it wouldn't fly without Brian's name on it. I mean, I heard that literally from business people, you know, until you get Brian in there, it's not going to happen, you know. And then, you know, it doesn't matter what terrible song it would be, that would be the single, and that would be, you know, the sales point. Brian's back, you know. So they had to do whatever they could to get Brian in the studio to do something. They managed to get Brian and the various people from the Wrecking Crew and so on, and from Universal Audio over to record with Brian. And finally did it, you know, finally got it together to do the 15 Big Ones albums.
The sort of scheme they came up with was this great sort of Brian is back mythos, this idea that Brian Wilson, after all these years, has finally gotten up, he's ready to work, he's going to produce an album for us. So this guy who produced and wrote all those great hits that you just bought in mass quantity with Endless Summer is producing, writing and producing, you know, work that you can now, new work that you can now buy in mass quantities. And not only that, he's going to be a performing, functioning member of this band.
A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, go!
I've stayed off the drugs and come back into my own. And between my wife, the doctors, and my brothers, and my mother, and a couple friends, they all convinced me to get out of my room, get back in there in the studio, and get to work.
I won't say that Brian wasn't nervous on the 15 Big Ones album, because that's, you know, Brian is back, but Brian doesn't want to be back, it might be the catchphrase for that album. And so even though all the people in the room were his friends from the old days, he just couldn't wait to get out of the room. He wasn't ready to come into the studio, but I suspect that if you left him alone and waited for him to get ready, he would never get ready, you know, so he needed a push. So he seemed uncomfortable, not because he wasn't used to what you do in a studio, but just because he was out and away from his bedroom. That was frightening to Brian, I truly believe. And, you know, but getting him into Brothers Studio, even with the only 2 or 3 very friendly people around him, he was still very nervous to deal with people that he didn't know. So that went slowly, but when it came to actually recording, that was in a way, I believe, his refuge. He could sit down at the piano and play comfortably. He could even be in front of the console and mixing comfortably. He knew exactly how he had done it, and he knew just how to do it. And the more times he stuck to his regimen, the more things got done.
The music that Brian was interested in working on was a source of conflict, however. Despite the wealth of new material he'd been writing under Landy's instruction, he was less comfortable developing these tracks and instead chose to feel his way back into the recording process by producing versions of rock and roll standards. Sessions broke down more than once, with the other Wilson brothers adamant that the original songs were far more vital. And in the end, the album 15 Big Ones was a compromise, a mixture of covers and new compositions. Despite a tepid critical reception, the first new Beach Boys LP in 3 years was their biggest seller since the mid-60s.
15 Big Ones was promoted bigger than any Beach Boy record had been for a long time. If it had been a real Beach Boy album, it would have been, I would have been happy. It would have been wonderful. If it had had that type of promotion, I think the Beach Boys, if they hadn't gone back on top, they would be at least up to the level of all the other, you know, popular bands. But, you know, it was just an album full of oldies that, you know, Brian tossed out. And so the fact that it sold well, I think, meant that the songs weren't offensive and that the promotion was incredible.
I don't have much against Martin unless they try to play it wrong. And lose the beauty of the melody until it sounds just like a sample. That's why I go for that rock and roll. It's got a backbeat, you can't lose it. I took
You know, 15 Big Ones feels a little more like batting practice, you know, to use an American image of baseball. He's there, you know, he's taking swings at stuff, and sometimes he whacks it really hard, and sometimes it's satisfying, and sometimes it just sort of like thumps into the catcher's mitt. It is not, you know, a record that comes from very deep within him. But it was a hit. I mean, it was a big hit, and it had a big hit single in his sort of arrangement of rock and roll music, which was a distinctively new kind of arrangement, you know, and bore his mark. But a lot of the other songs were rearranged in ways that I think people found like unsettling or off-putting, and certainly the band did, and they really didn't like the way that he was, you know, the sort of sound he'd come up with.
This next song I'm going to do is brand new from our album also. It was written by Brian Wilson, for sure, as most of our songs are. Fun is in, it's no sin, it's that time again to shed your load, hit the road on the run again. Summer skies and her eyes and a warmer sun. It's one for all for one, all for all of fun. Gotta get with it, gotta go through it, gotta go to it.
The revelations kind of come when you least expect them. They come, you know, I mean, he wrote a song called It's Okay, which is a very do-it-again kind of thing. It's nice. I like that song, actually. Had to Phone You sort of has it, but it's a very light, frothy record.
It's okay to get out there and have some fun by yourself, maybe, or else with a special one. Good or bad, bad or sad, it's all gonna pass away. So hey, that's okay, and enjoy all of that. Gotta get with it, gotta go through it, gotta go through it.
It's Okay might be the one thing he did on 15 Big Ones, right? That actually there was some effort behind. I mean, every time I listen to that song, it ends up engulfing me in the joy that the intent is. It's like Do It Again Part 2. You know, it really, that particular track works quite well. But off the top of my head, I can't think of anything else on 15 Big Ones that really, you know, kicks my butt.
The original Brian Wilson songs on 15 Big Ones are, I think, pretty ordinary. Nothing special. It's Okay is a good example, which is just okay. I mean, the vocals are really nice, and, you know, it's a nice production, but it's, you know, it doesn't just dazzle you. I think one song that's really telling is the one called That Same Song, which is a song about looking back on the songs that you grew up with and that you remember. And they even go back in music history to Gregorian chant and talk about the whole history of music.
Back in time with just a rhythm and rhyme, Gregorian chants were a real big thing. They took that chant and added harmony. It was a different sound but had the same meaning. I know, it took us a long while to go and find us a rock style. I know that we can make it one more mile, because we're singing that same song. We're still singing that same song. We're singing that same song, that same song, that same song.
I can imagine what a song like that might have been like if Brian Wilson had done it in the mid-60s when he was at the height of his creative powers. You know, he might have found some musical way to demonstrate this sense of a historical sweep within the song. Whereas the way they do it in 15 Big Ones, in that same song, you know, it's all in the same style. The music is all in the same style. It's a perfectly pleasant little song, typical of the other originals in that era and on that album. But there's no real organic connection between the message that the lyric has and the music itself.
But the public couldn't get enough of the Beach Boys or the return of their enigmatic leader. With the Brian's Back campaign in full swing, Wilson was thrust into the public eye like never before.
It kicked off this ginormous tour in the summer of '76 where the Beach Boys are back, and guess what? Now Brian's with them. And he's playing on stage. He's got this big silk bathrobe, which sort of both alluded to and satirized his bedroom years. You know, and I remember seeing that show in 1976 up in Seattle and feeling like this was awesome. Like this was exactly what I had hoped for. And they're playing massive amounts of oldies. Now the new stuff is maybe 25%. But Brian was way off his game. He barely sang. When he did sing, it was this kind of very rusty croak. It was a weird kind of moment, but if you squinted just right and blocked off certain things, it kind of worked, you know?
A recluse who was suddenly pushed into the media spotlight, Wilson's discomfort was often all too evident. Yet for the Beach Boys, the record label and the audience, the main thing was that he was there. He hit the interview circuit, made public appearances, and took part in an NBC special featuring a comedy routine with Saturday Night Live stars Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi, all celebrating the return of a great American composer. But others were keen on digging a little deeper, including Rolling Stone scribe David Felton, who spent unprecedented time with Wilson and his publicity-hungry therapist, Eugene Landy. In his seminal article, The Healing of Brother Brian, he documented a return to the limelight that was far more complex than the one the marketing machine was selling.
I think the question to me was not so much about what's he going to be like, but it was, what is he like after I met him? Like, is this the real Brian Wilson? How much have I seen of him? I never could tell, for example, I mean, Eugene Landy, his shrink turned public exploiter or whatever, the villain of the piece, he said Brian doesn't have that much sense of humor. And I never knew the answer to that. Does he or does he? Sometimes I thought he had a very wry sense of humor, and other times I felt he talked almost like a robot or somebody, sort of not programmed, but just stiff and without emotion, without affectation. He does what he's told, and he doesn't do much else. He answers your questions, but he doesn't offer too much. And I don't think that was being difficult. I think he really was waking up. And I don't think he exactly knew what to do other than what people sort of showed him to do. There were certain things he knew a lot about, but how he should act, he just didn't act very much, you know, and that way he kept out of trouble. He was having to learn to have a good time without all the things that previously allowed him to have a good time. It's pretty difficult. So I think he felt he had a big pressure to behave and to cooperate. And, you know, and if he didn't, he'd hear about it from Landy, often in front of everybody else.
Felton's article presented Brian in a very honest, forthright way. He clearly hit it off with the guy. Brian welcomed him into his inner sanctum. So he's getting Brian's thoughts, but he's also getting this kind of not so vaguely poisonous thing happening with Landy. Because Landy, one of Landy's great flaws is that he was a complete attention whore, that he needed the attention. And the moment he got his hooks, you know, the moment he got into a relationship with somebody like Brian, he wanted to stand up with him and be kind of like, you know, his partner.
Landy makes you tell that kind of story. I mean, he's such a performer. And just from the very beginning of his interview, I mean, you knew you had a character, you couldn't stop him. I mean, to him, he was the star of the story, and I let him be one of the stars, you know. He was full of himself. And, you know, I always thought he was bad-mannered and that he was exploiting his work with Brian at the expense of Brian, and I mentioned that. He was not an ethical guy, I don't think. And, you know, he did so many other things that you thought the whole thing might have been a scam. However, one way to keep a person from taking drugs is having a guard there to keep him from taking drugs. It's called prison, but it was in his home.
They were putting him out to be gone over. You know, they shoved him back in this, and he kind of became the locus of their image, the great Brian Wilson. And Felton's story, for all the kind of, you know, the facets that he brings in, including these kind of dark, horrifying facets, sort of ends on a kind of a note of hope. Brian's writing songs, you know, he's got a bunch of stuff. He's playing new songs for Felton, which Felton seems to like a lot, and it seemed to bode well, but it really didn't.
By the end of the year, with his fees having doubled since taking charge of Brian, Landy was fired by the Beach Boys' new manager, Steve Love. Yet his techniques had apparently been a great success, and Wilson entered the studio in October 1976 to begin recording the new tracks that he had played to Felton. His confidence growing, he also made 2 television appearances without the band behind him, on The Mike Douglas Show and Saturday Night Live, and the public was given a far more intimate performance than the live shows had allowed. Sat behind a piano, his voice gruff, the Randy Newman influence was now clear, but it left Beach Boys fans disheartened.
This is a song that comes off our current album, and the album is called 15 Big Ones, and it's called Back Home. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I'm going back this summer to Ohio. I'm gonna seek out all my friends I've always known.
When Brian appeared on Saturday Night Live, America just said, this guy ain't back. You know, if you've heard him sing Back Home, and I'm not going to do my impersonation, but, you know, in private, maybe sometime. But come on, man, that's not Brian Wilson's voice. Brian Wilson at the time said that he was influenced by Louis Armstrong. But when you have the gift of the voice that Brian Wilson had, and then you cut to Louis Armstrong, you just got to ask why.
This is a guy who 10 years earlier would stop the vocal sessions in the middle of a song because he didn't think there was enough emotion in the ooze. And you get to a point 10 years later where not only is he, I think, consciously singing in this gruff, rough, Randy Newman, Tom Waits-esque kind of voice, but he's kind of not caring or paying too close attention. I mean, he's mostly in tune, but he doesn't care that much anymore.
Well, I'm gonna spend this summer back home.
And for somebody who is that about vocals and vocal arrangements, that's where it begins to feel a little self-destructive, or at least as a kind of self-destructive gesture.
Yet Brian was pursuing very different artistic aims than simply satisfying his core fan base, and this new voice would be prominent on the material that he was developing. With the rest of the Beach Boys otherwise engaged, he was left to his own devices in Brother Studios with engineer Earl Mankey, and having rediscovered his enthusiasm for recording, he began to experiment with a passion that had been absent for the best part of a decade.
If 15 Big Ones was to get Brian comfortable in the studio by working with all of his friends from the old days, then as Brian came into the studio each day to work on new songs, I think the idea at that point was, let's bring in the guys one at a time as Brian needs them, you know. Given that structure, Brian ended up playing a whole lot more of his own instrumentation than he did. And no offense to Brian, but given that, it tended to be a lot more amateurish and a lot more what Brian played. The songs had a similarity because he had just learned how to work a synthesizer, and he had his favorite drum pattern that he always played and his favorite bass lines that he always played. So in the end, it was much more a Brian Wilson thing, I think, than even anyone might have hoped, because of the preponderance of Brian playing all the instruments. It was basically a Brian Wilson home recording.
Wilson's personal input into these songs was not just musical. Landy had also encouraged him to write lyrics, to get his thoughts onto paper, and to take inspiration from anything around him, no matter how insignificant. Not only did this lead to a wealth of material being quickly written, but it also created a catalogue of very personal work, detailing both the commonplace concerns and the inner life of its author, with song titles including Bring Your Own Comb and Quit Using My Toothpaste.
They may have seemed left field or odd. I do think that they were totally autobiographical, and the same as it's a lot easier to walk over and grab the synthesizer instead of calling in a string section. It's a lot easier to write the words than to try to get together with a lyricist, and I'm sure that would have been the easiest out for Brian. And Brian did write songs. It's not like he had never written any lyrics, but Brian Wilson lyrics maybe weren't as familiar to the public as those other lyricists were, and so the Beach Boy Love You songs might have seemed odder because nobody really knew what Brian was really like, you know.
And some of his bandmates wanted to keep it that way. By the end of 1976, Wilson had recorded enough tracks for 2 albums, and his initial intention was to release the most personal material as a solo album, entitled Brian Loves You. Yet when the other band members heard the results of his labor, they were far from impressed. And although the resultant LP would bear the name The Beach Boys and feature the involvement of the entire group, like Pet Sounds before it, the album bore the mark of one very singular creator.
My opinion of the Love You album is that it's a Brian record, and I guess it's because I know how it went down. It was a Brian record. He had no thoughts at all about being a Beach Boy. No, he didn't want to be a Beach Boy. No, he didn't want to do surfing songs for sure. And he was just he was most comfortable being an artist, you know, being whatever popped out of his head. But nobody had confidence in that. When Mike and Al heard it as not being the Beach Boys things that they could do live on stage and promote, you know, the Beach Boys live show, they thought it was crap. But, you know, Brian was doing what he had always done.
So tell her she smells good tonight.
I think that Brian could have used a lot more support. Not just from business people that you would expect wouldn't ever give you the support. They never have any sensitivity, but especially Mike and Al. If there was, it wasn't just a lack of support. It was an antagonism towards them. You know, Brian would play something that he'd been working on that he was proud of, and you know, they'd look at each other and, you know, give back. You know, they'd. You know, Alan would say to Dennis, he'd give him the finger underneath his palm, you know, when he hear the thing playing, you know, where Brian was trying to do his best, you know. And I felt like that was just a total lack of support. And I suspect it's still that way. And I don't see how Brian is going to produce in a situation like that.
Is somebody gonna tell me why she has to lie?
The most divisive album in the Beach Boys' entire catalogue, Love You was released in April '77 and polarised both fans and critics. Suffering from a lack of support from Warner Reprise and with no obvious singles to entice the nostalgia market, after all the Brian is Back hype, this bizarre record failed to match the success of 15 Big Ones.
This music was unlike anything you'd ever heard before, and not in the good way. You know, I mean, not immediately anyway. It was so different, and it was played almost entirely on synthesizer. And you listen to it the first few times, and it's like, how weird and off-putting is this? But it had a magic, because it came from this guy's heart, and this was his imagined world. And you get in there, and it's weird, but it's engagingly weird. It could only be made by one guy.
What do the planets mean? And have you ever seen sunrise in the morning? It shined when you were born. Saturn has rings all around it. I searched the sky and I found it.
It did sound childlike. It sounded very childlike. It sounded like cosmic nursery ditties in a way, and which I think it sort of is. There's a faux naive quality to it, or maybe just a naivete to the record. It sounds like a man who hasn't grown up, an outsider artist, maybe. There are moments where you sort of think about a Daniel Johnston. There are tracks by Daniel Johnston that are sort of have the same strangely childlike beauty and innocence to them. And so I think one almost does have to hear the album in that context. But at the end of the day, it feels like quite a happy record. It's not sort of troubled. I think it's one of the best Beach Boys albums, really. I think it's up there in its strange way.
Constellations are stars that form animals, Leo and Capricorn too. Star bright, starlight, make this wish come true tonight.
I take pride in it because it shows something that you would never see of Brian in your typical corporate presentation of Brian. You have to nail down your expectations of a Beach Boys song. You know, is it the old surfing fun thing with the, you know, rock and roll lyrics? Is it the production of Pet Sounds? Is it the simplicity and honesty of Beach Boys' Love You, you know? If you're looking for a more arty record, then Beach Boys' Love You is going to be that. And if you also know the backstory, oh, here's Brian, this crazy guy has been in his bedroom forever, and now he's coming out and doing some songs about watching Johnny Carson on TV. Well, you don't want to hear the big Pet Sounds production and external musicians doing complex parts. You want to hear Brian Wilson's voice crack while he tells you the story of Johnny Carson. You know, that's art. I don't know if Brian knew it was art, but but I recognize it.
He sits behind his microphone.
Johnny Carson.
He speaks in such a manly tone.
Johnny Carson.
One of the high points is this tune called Johnny Carson, which is about the TV, you know, the Tonight Show host, Johnny Carson, who at the time was a huge institution. You know, it was like he was the American late night talk show host. There were no others. I mean, nobody could, you know, Dick Cavett tried, couldn't knock him out. Mike Douglas could not knock him out. You know, all these guys sort of had their turn. And you know, and Johnny was the guy. He's singing the song about this guy, and he's talking about how manly his voice is. The listener says, what? You know, man, like that's not the first thing you think of with Johnny Carson. He's got a nice gruff, you know, he's got a grown man's baritone voice, and he smokes a lot, so it's a little rough on the edges. But, you know, and how he just keeps it up and he never stops, and the network makes him break his back, but he ain't going anywhere. You know, he's rough and tough, and he's the guy that we admire. You know, he's smart, he's funny, he's gutsy. You know, and he can do this night after night after night, and, you know, wow.
It's nice to have you on the show tonight.
This guy's like a factory of brilliance as far as he's concerned. Johnny Carson, what a genius. He just cranks it out, cranks it out, cranks it out, which is what Brian has been told to do for his entire adult life. Crank it out, crank it out, crank it out. So he's given it up to the guy that can really do it without losing his mind. And he's written and performed a song which sounds like a musical vision of a factory.
Because you like Brian Wilson so much, you know, his voice on Beach Boys' Love You is this acquired taste kind of thing. You have to kind of force yourself to go into that, you know, as opposed to the way the Beach Boys records really used to hit you was boom, you liked it right away. You know, it wasn't this like weird challenge to kind of like it. The guy can really write songs still, obviously, but the way he chooses to present himself as a singer just loses me, you know, and I think loses the public.
Despite its many merits, the public didn't warm to this new, exposed Brian Wilson. Failing to hit the top 50 in the US, it was deemed a misstep by a band eager to continue generating substantial touring revenue and to get out of their contract with Warner Reprise. Still riding on the wave of creativity that Dr. Landy's therapy had inspired, since January 1977, Wilson had been busy working on more new material for the proposed LP Adult Child. Yet the lack of sales for the Beach Boys' Love You meant that this album would never materialize.
Adult Child was really Brian Wilson starting to develop, and Brian Wilson starting to get good again. Life is for the Living. He goes back and he uses Dick Reynolds from the Christmas album, and who'd helped him with orchestration to the point where Brian was able to make Pet Sounds. He goes back and gets Dick Reynolds and does the arrangement on Life is for the Living. And the song, the lyrics mean something to people at that time.
Life is for the living. Don't sit around in your ass, smoking grass. That stuff went out a long time ago. Life is for
There was a definite move towards exercise consciousness and health food consciousness and the growth of that culture. And Brian was right on the cutting edge of that. Also, he tried to write this song, Still I Dream of It, for Frank Sinatra. And it was a really good attempt to write a song that Sinatra could have sang. And it was great. This is really good Brian Wilson music. And you know what? He's starting to lose that kind of bad edge to his vocals. And his vocals are actually starting to sound doable.
Still I dream a bit of that happy day when I can say I've fallen in love. And it haunts me so, like a dream that's somehow linked to all the stars above. Young and beautiful.
It was really the next step in Brian Wilson's development, because I think he's starting to write a little bit more about things that matter to people. And I think Brian was starting to grow. He actually has started to slim down. He looked better. And then gone.
The whole thing is just a very eccentric collection of styles and songs and ideas, at which point they heard that and they said, game over, buddy. We're taking back, we're taking back the reins. It's like, get away from the vehicle, keep your hands where we can see them, and we're going to take this somewhere else. And at the time, maybe Brian was just as happy. Maybe that kind of affront to his creativity was too much like Smile.
For less than 2 years, Brian Wilson had apparently been back. Yet in a repeat of 1967, the result of his labor was considered too distant from the band's original template and a threat to their mainstream popularity, and another album was abandoned. This time, however, a rift opened up at the heart of the Beach Boys.
Carl Wilson and Dennis Wilson are the vote here, saying we need to stay creative. At the same time, Mike and Al goes, no, we need to focus on this stadium rock stuff. Our success is because of our old songs. So this psychic split happens, and what does Brian Wilson do? He tries to avoid it as much as he possibly can, and he ends up voting with Mike and Al. I think Brian knew that Mike was going to work harder and be a little more safer bet to keep the band alive than Carl, who was still getting messed up on drugs, and Dennis, who obviously, was still getting messed up on drugs too. So I think Brian voted with like the safer thing. But the thing is, the public grows tired of repetition, and this is what led them down the path of, playing Anaheim Stadium to playing county fairs today.
Even if Mike Love may have seemed the safer bet as the leader of the band, his finger was typically far from the pulse of popular taste. Dennis Wilson had already been channeling his creativity into solo projects, and when sessions for the group's last Warner Reprise LP began, neither he nor his brother Carl attended. True to his vote, Brian Wilson joined his remaining bandmates to record what would become the Beach Boys' worst performing release since Sunflower, the MIU album.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Come into my heart.
These guys, like workmen, decide, well, what's worked lately? Surfing songs, car songs, girl songs. And so they write this album worth of like lukewarm, half-hearted crap. And sometimes with Brian's participation, which is really sort of the tragic part. You see Brian's compositional credit on these things and hear his voice on the songs on this album, and it's just like, it's like a nightmare vision.
It's been my secret passion to try it. In Captain Cook fashion, I can't deny it. I wanna spend my winters on the Kona coast in Hawaii. For years I saved my pennies and planned it. The great Pacific Ocean to span it. I wanna go
those guys, Al and Mike, have written songs that I like a lot and produced stuff that I like a lot. None of it's on this record. You know, it's a completely cynical attempt to be commercial. And it's completely wrong, and it was a huge disaster all the way around.
I can't say it better than the fact that Dennis Wilson's Pacific Ocean Blue album, the first solo album by any member of the Beach Boys, went to number 96. It hit the Hot 100. And meanwhile, the contemporary Beach Boys album at that time, MIU album, went number 151. So Dennis had done better on the album charts than the Beach Boys did in 1978, you know? That says a ton. It just doesn't communicate, you know? It doesn't really mean anything to people. It's just so bland.
The album's failure was insignificant compared to the deteriorating condition of the group's returned prodigal son. With Landy gone, his marriage falling apart, his brothers losing interest in the band, and the Beach Boys themselves selling out arenas but stagnating artistically, Brian Wilson once again began to decline. Back in 1977, the Beach Boys had signed to CBS Records, and after the release of MIU, Wilson was enlisted to produce the first album for the label. Yet, no longer in a fit state to work, he abandoned the sessions, and by the close of the year was admitted to hospital due to his fragile mental state. Although the resultant record, LA Light album, was a moderate success, Wilson's presence was minimal. By the end of the decade, back at home with 24-hour care, and with his marriage to Marilyn now over, the celebrations only 3 years beforehand seemed premature. Brian was back, but at what cost?
He was neither willing or able to be a functioning recording artist. You know, the cruel irony is that that was when they really had locked him into the touring party. And he was going out on the road, playing these shows, and it was just kind of getting worse and worse. You know, he just was getting bigger again. He was smoking, chain smoking on stage, and then take a cigarette out of his mouth long enough to like take a stab at singing God Only Knows or Good Vibrations or something, and it was not fun to hear. I think a lot of the times they either weren't miking the piano or they turned him way down because he would at times play other songs, you know. He was doing his own thing out there, and sometimes he was hooked up and he'd play stuff, and sometimes his mind would drift, and he just clearly didn't care. The extent to which he was willing to be on stage or would stay there all day and seem to be in the band was just like, okay, I have to sit here for a couple hours, I can sit here for a couple hours.
Everybody knows that Brian was, you know, the genius, the creative force, the guy who essentially wrote all that incredible music. It then does become important to sort of wheel him out from time to time, and, you know, with us almost like, you know, we all know about Brian's problems, don't we?
I'm going to take this opportunity right now to thank our beloved Brian for writing all that beautiful music and making this evening possible. Let's hear it for Brian Wilson.
Almost a kind of slightly patronizing, like sort of wheeling out your eccentric Uncle Albert or something. They can't really quite cut themselves loose from what Brian represents.
Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Wilson. We could ride the sun together while our love would grow. In my woody, I will take you everywhere I go.
He becomes a carnival bear, which dragged him out and like say, here he is, here's the guy behind it all. And it was just so bogus and so phony and just so misguided.
For many years, you would look at him and think, like, this is the saddest thing I've ever seen. Because you have this genius, the stone-cold American genius, being made to play the part of himself with zero interest, zero pleasure, and, you know, and it was just a tragedy unfolding before your eyes.
As this tragedy played out month after month in front of huge audiences, the turn of the decade saw any hope of the Beach Boys returning to their creative best disappear. As the moral majority and the rise of the new Christian right helped launch an era of conservatism through the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the band, dismissed by the counterculture in 1967, suddenly found a new place in a new America.
Come the 80s, you look at the Beach Boys and they absolutely seem to sort of stand for patriotic, white, Republican American values. The number of times they pitched up at the White House is bad enough, and then playing for Reagan, and I mean it's horrible. It just sticks in your craw. How can it not? And you see pictures of the Beach Boys in the 80s in their Puma socks and shorts and golfing attire, and you know, you realise they've just become these semi-retired sort of Santa Barbara millionaires, and it's just got nothing to do with rock and roll or pop culture anymore. It's just a business.
One of the parts of this, and I think it was actually one of the saddest, most pathetic parts of it to me, was when suddenly they began to brand themselves as America's band. So it's sort of like, oh, I get it. It's like a patriotic thing, you know. It's like they're trying to confabulate themselves with the idea of America, and they were sort of like, so now, which makes it even easier, because it's like, well, you know, they're like a national utility, you know, they're a national, resource in a sense. They needed to be popular, and however they could possibly prime the pump to make more money come through it was what they were going to do.
Yet although it was financially rewarding, this path was a dead end for the more creative elements of the ensemble. In 1981, while developing a solo career, Carl Wilson left the band, while brother Dennis found himself sporadically dismissed due to his unruly lifestyle. The only constant representative of the once dominant Wilson clan was Brian, a broken man without any purpose. By 1982, his health rapidly deteriorating, emergency measures were taken. Dr. Eugene Landy re-entered the life of his most famous patient, and within months he persuaded the Beach Boys to fire their most hallowed member. Brian Wilson was heading back into the wilderness.
It was wonderful at first. Brian suddenly lost about 150 pounds. He went from being morbidly obese to being in the best shape anyone had ever seen him in. But Landy's reemergence in his life was, as with so many things, a mixed blessing. He domineered every aspect of the guy and kept him from seeing the people he wanted to see, kept him from doing the things he wanted to do. Landy, again, saved Brian's life, without a doubt, saved his life, and then nearly killed him.
Across the next 2 decades, Wilson's output was sporadic, with his attempt to launch a solo career both encouraged and hindered by Landy, while his health was being compromised in private. Yet in the new millennium, free from his band and his psychiatrist, the last of the Wilson brothers would make a triumphant return to the world stage, and a new generation would witness the rebirth of an American legend. In the latter half of 1964, with the recent influx of British invasion bands dominating the American charts, Brian Wilson was working to a frenetic schedule. The overwhelming popularity of British acts had presented him with a formidable artistic and commercial challenge, and he had sought to meet it head-on. The Beach Boys' All Summer Long was followed by both a live LP and a Christmas record. In a single year, the band had released no less than 4 albums. The pace started to bite, and it was the hated live performances that provided the final straw. On a flight from Houston during the group's winter tour, Brian suffered a fully fledged panic attack. In the aftermath, it was decided that he would no longer appear on stage with the Beach Boys, that he would receive the long-sought freedom to remain in the studio and complete his work unfettered, and that a permanent replacement in the form of Bruce Johnston would join the touring band.
Brian had all these jobs. He had to melodically write it, arrange it, go produce the tracks, vocally arrange what everybody sang, sing often the high lead parts or on Don't Worry Baby, all these jobs, right? And then go on the road. The guy, if he had kept up that pace, he wouldn't be alive today. So somehow he gets Glenn Campbell to fill in for 3 months. And then I come along. I just probably got in there and he didn't have to go on the road anymore. And he could be uber prolific and work with the Wrecking Crew. And so the band now came home to tracks without the burden of those jobs, and especially being on the road. He made some great recordings.
He was, finally given the leeway to be the studio guy, to be just in control of the music and the writing and the recording and the arranging and the producing, that was all him now. Even to the extent that he was being talked about, it was on his own terms from this point on, because it was about him as a creative artist, not as a smiling pop moppet, or sensation. So he could, he was in control to a great extent. And as long as he continued to make hits, then he was allowed to be in control.
And Brian instantly applied himself in the studio with all the fresh energy of a liberated man. New sessions commenced in January '65, and the years spent in study and experimentation saw Brian arrive at a level of control room proficiency that could match, and indeed deliver, the further reaches of his compositional vision.
He started like a kid, and reached a lot of kids. And he was able to use that success to grow up in the studio musically quickly, and instead of the piano, the recording process became his piano.
The songs got better and better, and the music got better and better with Brian, as he felt more comfortable with us, and as the years rolled by.
There's no question that Brian was becoming more sophisticated. He wasn't afraid to talk to musicians. He was a young kid. He realized that he could get up and say, I want you to do this, and you do this, and you do this, which is kind of the way he would tell his brothers and his cousin, and they would, sometimes say, nah, we don't want to do that. They were kids. But all of a sudden, Brian was now with all these pros, and he was getting what he wanted.
Brian was in control. This was Brian's date, there was no doubt about it. That's why I say, when people say he was fragile, I said, are you kidding? That's not Brian. Brian was in total control. And he felt that way at that time, too.
Brian was the guy. He was the designated producer, this great creative guy with the authority of General Patton. He was so clear sounding. It was a pleasure to work with him and know him in those days. From my point of view, I like his production better than if he could do it now, starting as a young guy, because it was so musical. He had to get it. It actually sounded like the finished product on its way to getting finished when you'd be in the studio, because without the technology, he was more on the floor. He'd have instruments leaking into other mics. I mean, that was part of the accidental production, and you just go in there and in the booth and you go, wow, this sounds pretty good. And then Chuck Britz would have things ready. Hey, Brian, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? He'd audition tape delays and, all kinds of really interesting things.
If a musician wasn't getting it, over the talkback, he would go out there and he would either show them or guide them. He was able to communicate well with the other musicians who were a bit older than Brian and had been around a bit longer, this is old stuff for them, but with Brian's writing, it was actually new stuff for them.
Brian would sometimes work for 20 minutes, say, thank you, gentlemen, and leave. And sometimes we would work the full 3 hours or maybe longer. an entire weekend sometimes. He never accepted it unless he called me in and had me sit and listen to the song. He'd say, "What do you think?" I'd say, "It feels good to me. It feels great. You got a great track." He'd say, "Okay, thank you, gentlemen," or "Let's try another song."
Recording on his own terms, Brian was particularly industrious. He completed The Beach Boys Today by the end of January '65 and had finished sessions for a subsequent album, Summer Days and Summer Nights, by July. Though a high volume of output was nothing new, it was the character of both records that suggested a landmark had been reached. Much of the work, particularly on the second side of Beach Boys Today, departed from the scope of Brian's previous sound, while even the more familiar pop hits included unusual augmentations and sonic feints. The impression was that of a rigorous, thoughtful artist undergoing an important transition.
It was exciting because Brian had his act together, so no one had to suffer through the tracks. Of course, some of us loved playing on tracks and things. You know, Carl really loved to do that. So it was fun. You're red hot, you come off the road, and you're getting used to Brian having some great melodies, and Mike's like a runaway fax machine for lyrics.
He began to have different kinds of experiences, experimenting with marijuana, becoming a very enthusiastic pothead, experimenting with LSD to a small extent, not nearly as much as ultimately people would say. The doors of perception swung open, and suddenly, everything was up for grabs. Suddenly there were no boundaries whatsoever. Whatever he had been told about the limits of pop music, he just ignored altogether. And that really began to come out in the early months of 1965. I mean, the tunes that you can hear on the Beach Boys Today, that suite of love songs on the second side that are very pensive and poignant and musically sophisticated.
He takes side 2 of the Beach Boys Today album and totally dedicates it to ballads, but really strong ballads that have a thick sound with his bass playing, especially being prominent. He takes the vocals and he does all kinds of jazz layers on it, like a song, Kiss Me Baby, which is really more of a jazz tune than a rock and roll tune, but it's one of those real interesting early fusions of jazz and rock and roll, He takes that Four Freshmen thing and spreads it out.
In the introduction to Kiss Me Baby, you start to hear this in the vocals, okay? And then the melody starts, and you hear this. It's a simple little 4-note pattern, just going down a scale. But if you listen carefully, you start to hear that in all different ways. You hear it in the instruments, you hear it in the melody, you hear it in the backing vocals. And so it becomes this little idea that is the organic glue that ties everything together. This is the kind of thing that people talk about, when they talk about great songs from all periods and all styles. And pretty much all the songs in these albums of 1965 do something like that in one way or another. They're just really artfully constructed, and they show an imaginative musician really thinking about what he's doing and coming up with some just outstanding results.
Tossed and I turned my head, was so heavy. Babe, I wonder, as it got light, were you still awake like me?
You can also feel yourself on the headwaters of the Pet Sounds era, where the perspective really becomes grown up. lyrically, and musically as well. But more and more exotic instruments are creeping into Brian's songs. More and more unexpected chord changes, and more lush settings and lush vocal arrangements.
Pet Sounds is coming. There's a very disturbing yet interesting song in there called In the Back of My Mind. It's kind of all messed up. It's great. Not as a song, it's just great sonically. And you could hear, it's kind of, before you kind of organize all the pieces of it, you hear Pet Sounds coming in that. Probably no one ever talks about that. You got to listen to that track.
I'm blessed with everything, world to which a man can cling. So happy times when I break out in tears. The back of my mind, I still have my fears.
This is really dark, but it's interesting, and it's not quite a song to me, and I think Dennis sang it, but you just listen to the orchestrations of Pet Sounds, and you hear a little of In the Back of My Mind.
I tried to run far away from the past. I shouldn't try to keep away, but they just keep coming back to me.
There's a lot of fear and there's a lot of anguish about things that have been done wrong. And guilt, it closes with the strings and the orchestral instruments getting increasingly dissonant, clashing against one another as Dennis sort of reaches for these very high, stirring notes, saying that, what'll I do if she leaves me? It'll always be in the back of my mind. And you think and then the instruments kind of meander off into the darkness, these strings and bells and things, and it's like the orchestra's falling apart.
What will I do if I lose her? It'll always be way in the back of my mind.
In the Back of My Mind is about the guy's wife and the most intimate relationship you can ever have. It really, I think, radiates the complexities in Brian's inner life and how that comes through in his music, how he expresses that in music.
Wilson's desire to experiment, improve and refine perhaps found its clearest expression in his treatment of Help Me Rhonda. Inspired by a harmonica riff from Buster Brown's Fannie Mae, the song first appeared on The Beach Boys' Today. By the time of the album's release, however, Brian had recorded an alternative arrangement of the track, and the reworked version became the band's second #1 single.
The original version of Help Me Rhonda kind of shows where Brian's direction was going, and getting a large, big sound, and especially using the harmonica and the accordion in it, which became real important part of Pet Sounds later. So what happens is they take this one song from Beach Boys Today, Help Me Rhonda, which was more of a production piece on Beach Boys Today, and they turned it back into more of an old-fashioned rock and roll hit.
I like the second version of it. Bum, 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 bum. I love the bass part in it. It seemed like that version hit the ball out of the park in American baseball. You know, the first one maybe got you to second base. Somewhere between Brian and Mike, they had the good sense to re-record it. And it really deserved it.
I come in late at night and in the morning I just lay in bed. But Ronnie, you look so fine, and I know it wouldn't take much time for you to help me, Rhonda, help me get her out of my heart. Help me, Rhonda, 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 help me,
I remember talking to Brian, and I said, why don't we take the recording of Help Me Rhonda and put it in Summer Days and Summer Nights? Well, you know, we just had it in the last album. Brian, you didn't have this recording that was #1. Let's put it in there. It should just be there, you know. So that was more of a straight ahead, you know, verse chorus kind of album. But if you listen to Wrecking Crew, they're doing some really great stuff in it.
Although many of the idiosyncrasies of today were absent from Summer Days and Summer Nights, it still exhibited features of Brian's figuring out process and elements that prefaced his later Pet Sounds work. The album's centerpiece was yet another installment in the relentless train of hit singles and went on to become one of the definitive Beach Boys tracks, California Girls.
Lyrically, silly, basically, just a you know, guided tour of chicks from different regions, but set into this alarmingly cool, you know, sort of sonic setting, you know, which begins with this sort of orchestral opening, which, you know, seems to come from Aaron Copland's Book of Tricks, which establishes kind of like a country and western rhythm.
California Girls. Okay, I'm going to play the body of it. See them tumbling down, ba ba da 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 da. Now you've heard that tune, right? See, so he probably got the idea of the bass line from that style of music. You know, I played that when I had to do some tapes for the EMT Music Museum in Seattle. You know, I started playing this line. It was on the tape. And the guy said, "Oh yeah, country music." I said, "No, it's not country music. That's Brian Wilson's bass line."
I remember going to Columbia Studios and hearing the start of the song, and I went, "Wow!" And it was California Girls. The very opening part of that song before they come, that's actually, if you listen to it, that's Pet Sounds. That's the start of Pet Sounds, I think.
Well, East Coast girls are hip. I really dig those styles they wear. And the Southern girls, with the way they talk, they knock me out when I'm down there. The Midwest farmers' daughters really make you feel alright. And the Northern girls, with the way they kiss, they keep their boyfriends warm at night. I wish they all could be California. I wish they all could be California. I wish they all could be California girls.
If you listen to the recording, you've got Carl playing the 12-string part, and you hear the band go, dun, dun, bum, and then a big chord, not beating you over the head. So it's like a theme. I mean, it could have been anything classical, like Beethoven's bum, 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 bum. You have bum, 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 bum. It's great. And then the rhythm starts, all this stuff, you know, heralding the fact that you should pay attention to this cool song. And a great chorus. And fantastic, perfect pocket symphony single.
You're not even hearing a specific instrument. You're hearing the sweep of the record. It's more about the whole. And so music isn't coming from a band so much. It's coming from a creative idea that's translated onto tape via instruments, but the instruments specifically aren't the important part. You're not listening to somebody jamming. You're listening to people making sounds. And that's how Brian Wilson is starting to become a really unique, not just a record producer, but a musical entity, you know?
Though Summer Days and Summer Nights peaked at #2 on the Billboard chart, clustered around it were the icons of the burgeoning American counterculture. Along with the Beatles beginning their journey toward the left field, the Rolling Stones represented the rebel edge of the British invasion, and an electric Dylan the prophet of the bohemian youth. With the nation's young dispatched to war in Vietnam, civil rights clashes in Alabama, and a growing politicization of art and culture, airy Californian beach fantasies seemed far from relevant.
The famous Jimi Hendrix quote, "You'll never hear surf music again," that embodies a kind of dismissal of surf music, and in many ways a dismissal of the Beach Boys. That was in the air, you know, as the 60s moved along. There was something about the early Beach Boys music that seemed adolescent in a way. This didn't take into account the complexity of what the music was, the complexity of the vocals, the vision that the songs represented. I mean, things were changing very rapidly, and nobody was accounting for all that. It's only later that people would go back and realize how great those early songs were.
I think naivete is a perfect word to describe the lyric content of most of the, or certainly early Beach Boys records. But it's also very, very true and heartfelt. And I think the reason that it was so successful is that people who listened to it recognized the truth of it.
The idea that the early Beach Boys songs were anti-intellectual is probably true. I mean, it was a vision of California that was sensual. That was the appeal of it.
Whether it was shallow, I mean, I don't. The thing is, at that time in pop culture and rock music, the Beatles were, you know, becoming more sophisticated. They had found in their own way a more sophisticated worldview. And that is really, I think, in a lot of ways, the headwaters for the transformation of the vocabulary of rock and roll and pop culture, youth culture. Because, you know, John Lennon could sing about paranoia in conscious terms, whereas your average Beach Boys song or your average pop song was more, IU, surfer girl type stuff. But on the other hand, I mean, just given who Brian is and the complexity of his emotional state, even these songs that people think of as very sunny, fun songs are far away from that, are much more complex than that. There are definite strains of anti-intellectualism within the group, but a lot of that was just based, I think, on the traditional sort of pop showbiz conservatism of, you know, you've got a formula, it works, don't mess with it.
Though messing with the formula was to become the guiding principle of Brian's approach in the latter part of the decade.
He's a real man, sitting in his nowhere land, making all his nowhere plans.
Whether or not the mid-60s cultural milieu had presented the Beach Boys with something of a quandary, it had certainly liberated their chief songwriter from the record industry's infatuation with the hit single. The release of the Beatles' Rubber Soul in December 1965 had further expanded the frontiers of popular music, suggesting that the album could represent a complete work, beyond simply being a vehicle for singles. Naturally, the record and all of its implications made a huge impression on Brian Wilson.
The movement from singles to albums represented a major cultural shift. In terms of how artists would be treated, the fact that you would call them artists. I mean, nobody was calling Chuck Berry an artist. Nobody was calling Buddy Holly an artist. You know, but now, you know, there's this moment where because of the Beatles and Bob Dylan, you know, you have an environment in which it was possible to make an entire statement in an album, that an album was a coherent body of work that wasn't just hanging on a hit single. That was revolutionary at the time. So when Brian Wilson heard Rubber Soul, what he heard was a suite of songs. What he heard was a way in which you could be considered that way, to be thought of that way as an artist. And Brian Wilson wanted that. And so when he heard Rubber Soul, that's what he wanted to do, and an artist is what he wanted to be.
I think Brian, in his competitive world, thought he could probably maybe make a better album in terms of front to back. Little did he know he did.
Brian's response to Rubber Soul was to conceive an album consistent in sonic identity and lyrical narrative, with all the ebbs, flows and movements of a single song running across the order of its tracks. To achieve the task, he once again looked beyond the Beach Boys for a writing partner and established a collaboration with young advertising executive and lyricist Tony Asher. As the project took shape in the early months of '66, the band, occupied with the demands of a Far East tour, had little notion of the radicalism that was afoot back home.
Carl used to tell me, he said, Brian's doing something that'll blow your mind, Bruce. Brian and Carl were really close. I just figured, I just took it for granted Brian would be the greatest, because he was. And I'd come home and hear some really cool stuff, and I did, you know, but I didn't realize it was going to be that.
There were no limits whatsoever. If he was going to just throw open every cupboard there was in the studio, pull out all the most exotic instruments, from banjos to early synthesizers like the theremin, that made that high ghostly wail. You know, every weird sort of percussion thing, and if they couldn't find a percussion thing to, you know, to make the right sound, then he would just figure out a way to use a water jug.
You know, he didn't know any better. He just said, well, let's do this. Let's get the 2 accordions for God only knows. Let's try this. So he was so open because he didn't have formal training, or he wasn't a big band guy or a jazz guy. He just heard music and loved it so much, and that's the way he kind of assembled the blocks.
And plus, you know, they were going to sing these songs about essentially a concept record about the arc of a love affair, from Wouldn't It Be Nice, the sweetness and innocence of that, to all the way to the end of Caroline No, where he's looking at this, you know, older, harsher version of the young woman he had met at the beginning of the album and saying, you know, plaintively, where did your long hair go? Where's the girl I used to know? And all the stops in between with songs about living away from home, trying to invent your own character, songs about, you know, this deepening love affair that moves from Wouldn't It Be Nice to You Still Believe in Me to, you know, God Only Knows.
Well, as Brian said, that album was marijuana. So that's what's going through it. There's just this deep, restful, sonic, echoey marijuana.
The consequent album, Pet Sounds, was recorded with all the fastidious energy that typified Brian's post-touring work. He completed all the instrumental tracks with the Wrecking Crew in advance of the band returning from tour, to be promptly drilled through the vocal parts.
When he'd be in the studio, he'd be so focused. He would, like a drill sergeant, no, do it again. But it wasn't where I think you see some producers come in and they'll jingle money and they're all, hey, how you doing? And make everybody feel good, and they don't know what the hell they're doing. They just vibe in the room. And some guys go in and they're really engineers. They can they'll do it up and down. So he had the ability to do all of that stuff, but he never worked in the studio trying to do a thing of authority, of intimidating people. He he accidentally did it just because of the intensity and his knowledge. No, do it again. Come on, speed it. You slow it down and watch your note on the, on the fourth bar there. You're sliding too much. Give it a little more breath. These studio guys will go, holy crap, this guy's hearing everything.
Take it from that spot, please. Hey, wow, just that one spot, right, Dad? No, just the one spot. Drew. Octave lower, Don, please. And watch that bum, 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 dee, dee, dee. Let's make it real tight, okay? So many lags or screws up in the first half of that thing all the time. Let's go.
I don't think he's the kind of guy that wants to be in charge, but he has to be. He's young enough to know that the only way he's going to get this done is to just be in charge. But I don't think that's in his personality to be, you know, a drill sergeant. But at sometimes he really had to control his wild boys. You know, young guys, you know, with the great cars and some dough and, you know, and want to go out with their girl to the restaurant and the session's running late. I mean, you know, come on, just sit down. We've got to finish this vocal, you know.
Wouldn't it be nice if we were older, then we wouldn't have to wait so long? And wouldn't it be nice to live together in the kind of world where we belong? No, it's gonna make it that much better when we can say goodnight and stay together. Wouldn't it be nice if we could wake up in the morning when the day is new, and after having spent the day together, hold each other close the whole night through? Of happy times together we've been spending. I wish that every kiss was never ending. Oh, wouldn't it be nice?
Pet Sounds is a song cycle, in my opinion, in the tradition of the great song cycles of earlier periods. Art songs of the Romantic period, for example, we talk about Winterreise by Schubert or Dichterliebe by Robert Schumann. And in my opinion, Pet Sounds is the 20th century version of that. Clearly, what they ended up with is something that is as cohesive as any great song cycle and has a story to tell, just like any great song cycle. In the future, when people look back on music of the 20th century, Pet Sounds will be considered a landmark in that approach to songwriting.
Pet Sounds was a highly personal record in a way. And its fascination with sound, and its fascination with sound almost beyond the sense of what a song was. It's very much, I think, where Brian Wilson lived emotionally.
When he did the track, The God Only Knows, I was just amazed at the track. But I had not heard the vocal. I hadn't heard the title, really. So when I heard this track, the track was so beautiful. But then when I heard the melody, it was so far removed from the track, it blew my mind. It was so incredible. And then at the end of the song, Hal Blaine does, like at the end of the song, da 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 da, 2/4, and at the end it goes da 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 da, da 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 da. What is this drummer doing? It's wacky. And then when you hear the final version, that was there because the voices there's only 3 voices on that, and it sounds like it's an amazing amount of voices. I think he did actually 2 of them at the end. And it all just fits like this. But when I heard the track, it was hard to figure out, why is he doing that? Just amazing.
much love you. But long as there are stars above you, you never need to doubt it. I'll make you so sure about it. God only knows what I'd be without you.
God Only Knows. I think it's a great song for lots of reasons. It has everything you want in a great song. It has sensitive text. It has a melody that matches the text perfectly. And it has all these Brian Wilson touches that really raise it to a whole new level. That melody. At first, when you hear that in the introduction, you're not really sure what it's connected to. But then at the end, when all the voices are layering each other, that's the melody that Brian Wilson sings, above all the other parts that are going on. It's also a really nicely crafted chord progression. You don't really know what key it's in. It sort of moves around and sounds like E at first, then it sounds like A. It never really stabilizes on a particular key.
And God only knows what I'd be without you. God only knows what I'd be without. God only knows what I'd be without. God only knows what I'd be without.
That to me is the most completely developed and most intelligent and most beautiful of all the songs that he ever wrote. It's perfect in every way. Melodically, it's a little Bach invention. The arrangement is perfect. Lyrically, there's not a wrong word in the song. And then there's the spectacular fugue at the end. So it's kind of a teen record, but when I heard it, I thought, this is something that I'd never heard before, that I didn't think anyone in the genre was capable of doing.
Pet Sounds did, however, contain one song that was not a Wilson original, a leftover from the Summer Days and Summer Nights sessions entitled Sloop John B. Although a number 3 hit as a single, Sloop John B has often been cited as an anomalous feature of Pet Sounds, an unnecessary interruption to the love affair concept and the album's lyrical narrative.
Al gave him this idea. Al loved the Kingston Trio and folk music. He said, Brian, we've got to record Sloop John B, which was in the public domain, which means you kind of become the writer. You're the arranger, but you become the writer, adapted by. So a couple days later, during Summer Days, Summer Nights sessions, he comes in with a complete track. And I don't know why it never got into Summer Days, Summer Nights. It somehow doesn't, When in the Pet Sounds doesn't fit, but we're used to it.
We come on the sloop John B, my grandfather and me, around Nassau town we did roam, drinking all night, got into a fight. Well, I feel so broken, I wanna go home. So hoist up the John B. sail.
You hear all this angst and stuff, lyrically, in this album. And then suddenly we're doing a folk song about the sloop John B. Unless it's some kind of dream sequence, it just doesn't fit.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I feel so broke up. I wanna go home.
I don't even know, other than Capitol thinking, well, we need a hit on that album. You know, I think that was more of a record company thing to slide it in there. I think it fit on Summer Days and Summer Nights. I mean, I think that's the flaw in the ointment on Pet Sounds. It just doesn't make, it's brilliant, it doesn't make any sense being on that album.
So, hoist up the John B. Hoist up the John B. See how the mainsail, see how the mainsail. Call for the captain ashore. Let me go home. Let me go home. I wanna go home. Let me go home.
Probably the most controversial thing about the album is the inclusion of Sloop John B. In the context of the narrative of the album, I think it's easy to look at that song and say it has no business being there since he didn't write it. It's this sort of exotic journey down to what sounds like the Caribbean, these guys drinking rum and getting arrested. When I listen to it and you think about the sense of displacement that the narrator describes, who constantly is saying, I want to go home, I want to go home, you know, I feel so break up, I want to go home. This is the worst trip I've ever had. People see it as out of place. I see it as a pivot point.
Sloop John B was preceded as a single release by the closing track on Pet Sounds, Caroline No. The record only made a modest impression on the charts, peaking at 32, but, significantly, it appeared with Brian Wilson and not the Beach Boys as the named artist. Given that Pet Sounds was such a personal statement, the fact that its lead single was issued as a solo sat uncomfortably with some in the band.
Maybe Pet Sounds kind of was Brian's solo album, but there we are, so we're part of the album, and I have no idea whose idea it was to put Caroline No out, which I love. I don't think it was, I think maybe Beach Boys as the artists, build artists, even though there are no vocals on it. Yeah, okay, fine. Maybe it could have had more chart impact, but I never got why it was a Brian Wilson, why it was released as a single.
Where did your long hair go? Where is the girl I used to know? How could you lose that happy glow? Oh, Caroline, no. Who took that look away? I remember how you used to say you'd never change, but that's not true. Oh, Caroline, you break my heart. I wanna go and cry. It's so sad to watch a sweet thing die. Oh, Caroline.
Pet Sounds, in a weird way, it is a solo record, but in the same way that Beach Boys today is kind of a solo record, because they didn't really have a lot of creative input into the record. They didn't play on it, you know, they came in and sang the parts he told them to sing. You know, literally, they were touring Japan when he was writing and recording Pet Sounds. And then they came in and he said, okay, here are your parts, sing these songs. And it was a huge departure for them. And there was a lot of controversy within the group and within the family about the creative turn that Brian had made.
Brian doesn't have a mean bone in his body. He's a sweetheart. He's a wonderful guy. He was always trying to make everybody happy in the band. He was getting so much flack from certain people in the group about doing it that he went overboard to make it like a group album. But it was all him. It was basically a solo album. And I would think if you asked the guys in the group reluctantly, they might say, yeah.
And I think there was also some fear that, you know, he was getting farther and farther away from the band. And as a result, he was going to leave the band and do his own thing, at which point everyone's sweet living this whole family industry was going to fall apart because Brian was going to say, you know, screw you guys, I'm going to do my own industry. So the fact that he ended up releasing Caroline No as a solo single was like a shot across the bow and kind of made him freak out a little bit, more than a little bit. Given the distance that he's traveled from the traditional settings and narratives of Beach Boys songs, that I think probably they began to put two and two together and think that this was not moving in a direction they wanted to go.
Indeed, on returning from tour to be presented with the Pet Sounds instrumentals, some in the band expressed reticence over the sound of the material, with Mike Love cautioning Brian not to carry the Beach Boys too far from the tried and tested.
Yeah, don't fuck with the formula was really, he said that straight up. Tony Asher attests to that, having heard it. But Mike was by no means the only one who didn't want, you know, who felt, you know, like the record was not the record that they needed to make at that time. The brothers were bitching and moaning too. They didn't like how complex the arrangements were. They didn't like the fact that Brian was listening to them so closely and would brook no bum notes at all.
I don't really think that that's true about the band. I think the band, they trusted Brian and he made great tracks. I think we were more of one mind than you would think. I mean, we all have pretty good ears, you know, and we're smart enough to know there's a song on top of those tracks to come, you know, and it always does work out with Brian in those days.
I was there when Brian mastered it. He puts on the first tape, wouldn't it be nice? And it starts playing the first side and it's going through. And I'm thinking how great it sounds. And Brian looks over at me and says, well, Fred, what do you think? And I said, Brian, man, great record. It's really good. I like it. I really like it. He said, do you really like it? I said, yeah, I really like it. And then he asked me the tell-all question. He said, what do you think the guys will think? Meaning, what do you think the other Beach Boys will think? And I said, you know, I don't know, Brian, but I'm proud of you. It's a great record. I don't know what they think, but I think it's a great record. I think you did a great job. And he says, man, I sure hope they like it. Well, as we know, a couple of them didn't. Capitol didn't.
With Capitol Records showing little enthusiasm for the sonic invention of Pet Sounds, the record became the lowest-selling Beach Boys release in years. While Brian became discouraged by the muted response to his grand artistic statement, the label delivered the ultimate slap in the face. Just weeks after the release of Pet Sounds, they issued the Best of the Beach Boys compilation, surf music and all.
Capitol was a little confused by Pet Sounds, you know, and they were kind of thinking, okay, wow, Brian, nice work. Get Volume 1, Best of the Beach Boys ready, everybody, marketing staff. Yeah, we'll look for some singles. You know, they were just getting ready to write the band off, I think.
You know, he was working within the context of the music industry, and the music industry that was just beginning to feel its possibilities for major sums of money. And so they were not interested in the Beach Boys, of all people, breaking new ground. I mean, they saw the Beach Boys as hit makers, like go make hits. You know, a song called, you know, Hang On to Your Ego, that's not going to wash. And in many ways, you know, Mike Love probably agreed with the critique. These, you know, complicated, strange, very beautiful, but not necessarily contained songs. I mean, they didn't really provide Mike Love with much of a platform. And, you know, there you have the origins of difficulties that went on for decades after that. You know, that was the moment. You know, I mean, Pet Sounds was the moment. It's sad, though, in a lot of ways. I mean, it's something that drove Brian deeper into isolation. It was something that, in a more nurturing atmosphere, he might have had a happier time and even a more productive time.
They didn't believe in it, you know? And then here, you know, the records end up selling off of it. The 45s off Pet Sounds did well. So Brian Wilson must have been very frustrated by that. I'm certain of it. But because Wouldn't It Be Nice and Guy Lano's had such a good, successful run in the summer of 1966, and then Brian Wilson works that summer on Good Vibrations, and that becomes #1 in America and in England, Capitol just does a complete about-face, and they throw money into the next Beach Boys album, which would have been Smile.
The project that would eventually become known as Smile started life during the lengthy gestation of Good Vibrations that ran throughout 1966. Initial recordings for Good Vibrations had taken place as part of the Pet Sounds sessions, but the song had taken on a life and logic of its own, with Brian moving between studios to rework the material. While Pet Sounds had come and gone, he was still tortuously fashioning a final version of the track and running up a ballooning studio bill in the process.
I got my info from Carl, and he would just give us little progress reports, you know, and Brian would just, like a great filmmaker, you know, shoot a scene several different ways, edit it several different ways, and I'm just going to guess Brian wasn't ready. He probably wasn't thinking, well, we need this to drive the marketing of Pet Sounds. I don't think he was thinking of it that way. I think he was totally in pure, wonderful, once-in-a-lifetime artist mode, and it just didn't make the cut.
We did many, many sessions, not as many nearly as some of the other people have stated. But it was true that we, you know, he'd call me and he'd say, can you get the crew in? We're going to work at 5 o'clock or something like that. I'd say, you know, and nobody wanted to miss that. So whatever we were doing, we were there at 5 o'clock. And we would sit down and Brian would play something at the piano. And then he'd say, forget it, I'm out of here. And he'd leave. So we worked for 15 minutes, if that.
We wondered at the time, I said, gee, he's sure spending a lot of time, but we knew it was a hit. He was trying to achieve something righteous and something artistic with something pretty simple. It was simple. The simpler tunes are the toughest ones to make into a hit record.
Pet Sounds, yes, great, wonderful. If we had included the version you heard, we all heard, in mono, I had to add mono, of Good Vibrations, be a different Beach Boys story.
I was wondering, how was he going to put these little pockets of music? They're done at different studios. And in those days, how was he gonna match the ambient room sound of one studio to another studio, a month apart, different? And it was just amazing how he put it together.
It's not just the studio as an instrument. That's a vague saying. No, he knows the tone and the pitch like a string, you know, or like you tune a guitar. Well, you could tune echo in this room so it'll sound this way. And he took the diversity of those rooms and played them. That big studio is his guitar, you know? It's real specific when they say the studio as an instrument, and Brian Wilson was the only guy who ever really utilized this in such a way, in 3 different studios at least on Good Vibrations.
Gotta keep those love good vibrations happening with you. Gotta keep those love good vibrations happening with you. Good vibrations give me the excitation.
cultural watershed. It changed the entire musical vocabulary of pop music, just because of the way, the way its sections clearly were separate from one another, the way that just the lightest sort of veneer held them all together. And yet the song flowed perfectly from, churchly kind of organ sounds to full-on like fuzz guitar and synthesizer, again with the theremin wail.
As intelligent and as creative that song is, it was a little more clinical to me, a little drier. It didn't, he was moving from marijuana to a little speed or something.
I remember when I heard the final mix, I remember saying to the band, this is probably #1 or our career's over. It was do or die with that. And I, it was so radical, it could only be one of the two things.
When the single finally appeared on the 10th of October, '66, it proved to be a huge hit, landing at #1 on both sides of the Atlantic. Smile, under the working title of Dumb Angel, had been developing fitfully over the preceding months. Collaborating with a new lyricist in the form of Van Dyke Parks, Wilson had envisaged an album that would match the coherence of Pet Sounds, yet stretch even further in sonic and narrative ambition. Capitol, enticed by a whole album that promised to replicate the sound and success of Good Vibrations, were now ready to hand Brian a blank check. The label mobilized a formidable marketing campaign, promising Smile by the end of the year and making grandiose statements about the album's likely impact.
Smile is the name of the new Beach Boys album, which will be released in January 1967. And with a happy album cover, the really happy sounds inside, and a happy in-store display piece, you can't miss. We're sure to sell 1 million units in January.
For the first time, the Beach Boys had beaten the Beatles at their own game and, in their own backyards, essentially, as the most popular rock and roll band on the planet. And everyone at that point expected nothing but more triumphs from the Beach Boys. They found themselves suddenly at the leading edge of pop culture at a time when pop culture meant more than ever before. And so, Brian was going great guns at his next, the album he said was going to flow from the exact same sort of headwaters, creative headwaters that Good Vibrations did.
The concept for Smile is sort of threefold. There was a life suite, there was a Western suite, and there was an element suite.
They started thinking about an approach to writing a song and writing an album that started in Good Vibrations, which is to think of modules of ideas that could be put together ultimately into this album that they were calling Dumb Angel. And they wrote 4 songs initially: Heroes and Villains, Cabinescence, Wonderful, and Surf's Up. Especially those 4 songs, I think, show that Brian Wilson had an idea that would have surpassed Pet Sounds in its artistry, in its storytelling, in its conception as a whole thing, a whole concrete musical idea portrayed over 2 sides of a record.
Brian and Van Dyke's primary efforts took place in an atmosphere of unbridled enthusiasm, and with the Beach Boys on tour, the LA songwriting division began to resemble something of a carnival. Surrounded by a coterie of friends and associates, Brian's reveries extended to constructing a large Arabian tent indoors, holding meetings in the swimming pool, and perhaps most famously, siting his home piano in a giant living room sandbox. Though such eccentricities would later be pointed to as symptoms of excessive drug use, They were more likely the imaginative leaps of a young, rich musician, fully possessed by creative energy. Indeed, the sessions in the Sandbox yielded a group of compositions that formed the basis of Smile.
The Sandbox was just a box that he had made. It was full of sand that he could sit in, feel like he was at the beach. Mine was not to ask why, nor to reason why. This was his house and his sandbox.
I think it was very practical. It was, you know, he's writing a song like Surf's Up, and he's got his shoes and socks off, and there's a piano there, and he's got his feet in the sand. Shut your eyes, and he's writing about Surf's Up. I mean, how perfect, you know? And then Louie and Banana, his dog, started crapping in it, and that kind of blew that.
People who are talented like to have fun, you know, and they like to enjoy all kinds of strange things that we, not 9-to-5ers, don't know anything about, you know. So recording in a swimming pool that the water had been taken, yeah, that makes sense because the sound has to be great down there, you know. So, you know, but they use these things to try to say, well, Brian is crazy. I said, yeah, I mean, crazy like a fox.
A lot of people have said that drugs were a problem, but from what we find out, that drugs were a problem later on, after Smile collapsed, because you can hear in the session tapes that Brian Wilson is in control and on the money and making incredible music that no one has ever done before. He's not out of control. He is totally in control of those sessions.
Though Brian's idiosyncrasies fast became a feature of the studio work. The modular recording style and unorthodox compositional turns mystified many of the session players and, often accompanied by his entourage, Brian encouraged a mood of levity and experimentation.
This was his baby. And we were just working little parts. Ba-doom-doom, ba-doo-dee, ba-doom-dee, ba-doo-dee. These are things that he wanted done, and we were doing them. And then they'd say, thanks, that's enough. In other words, he heard something at home, he drove to the studio, he wanted that 3, 4, 6, 8 bars. He wanted to hear it. Once he heard it, okay, I'm going. That's enough. And then he'd go home, I guess, and work on whatever else he was working on. For us, it was amazing. We never saw this with other producers or directors. They said, here's the song, we played it. With Brian, he'd say, here's the intro.
Ending, take 3.
With the Smile album, that was cut in pieces, you know. And so I thought, well, that's strange. But, you know, you have to remember when we do film scores, we cut film scores in pieces, too. When you go to a film score day, you might do the middle part first, and then the ending next, and then the theme of the song. You jump around with different pieces of a film score. And so I just thought that that's the way he's thinking these days, you know, to cut record dates. You accept the way he is, because he was a fine writer, you know, and every time he cut something, it was a big smash hit, so you trust him.
Okay, one more. That's gonna be very good, okay? Don't worry about how it falls apart at the end of the verse. That's generally what it's supposed to do. Hey, but don't worry about it, Carol. You mustn't. You mustn't worry. You mustn't. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, I'm kind of the worry wart of the studio musicians, right? Being a woman, you know, yeah, I'm gonna worry about you kids, yeah.
It was just parties. These were all parties, you know, with the firemen's hats and all of the things that the guys were doing. I don't think anybody was taking anything serious.
He brought in some firemen's helmets, and so somebody started a fire in a waste paper basket or some.
There was a helper, assistant guy called Brother Julius with a big bucket, put wood in it, light it, and he brought it into the studio while they were playing. Fire, you know, that Miss O'Leary scout.
But again, the Beach Boys were on tour and they came home and they found these songs that he wanted them to sing that bore absolutely no resemblance to anything that seemed like, you know, normal life. Heroes and Villains and Van Dyke Parks wrote these songs that were just oblique, to say the least. The famous line that caused Mike Love to blow his top was in the song Evanescence, which is a sort of a impressionistic portrait of the wide open frontier and the procession of pioneers moving further west, and describing this vision of a worker on the railroad, a Chinese worker who sees a bird fly up in the air looking down at him, and suddenly you're seeing the world through the bird's eyes as he's saying over and over, the crow flies uncover the cornfield. Mike Love was like, what the hell is this? Like, what could this possibly mean?
There's a very famous story about Mike Love coming in the studio and sort of point-blanking Van Dyke Parks as to what the lyrics meant.
I wasn't close enough to the other guys. I was in a position of defending my lyrics. It went from Dingwoody Pearl, Hang Ten. I mean, I didn't know that language, to like columnated ruins domino. Mike Love said to me one day, he said, explain this. Over and over, the crow cries, uncover the cornfield. And it was an American Gothic trip that Brian and I were working on. I said, I don't know what these lyrics are all about. They're unimportant, throw them away. And so they did.
You know, Mike wanted to have some kind of definitive answer as to what does it mean specifically. And it's like, you know, and Van Dyke couldn't answer specifically because it was more about images.
The encounter concluded with the departure of Van Dyke Parks from the Smile project. Though expectations for the album remained excessively high, and a buzz had developed amongst insiders privy to some of the material, the early months of 1967 saw the pressure on Brian and his as yet unfinished masterpiece begin to mount.
There began to develop this sense that Brian was on the verge of a masterwork beyond all masterworks. The only problem was the Beach Boys, and I think to a great extent Capitol Records, were having none of it. To the extent that they did sing the songs, they did it under pressure and gave a lot of duress to Brian along the way. The vocal sessions were very tense. And meanwhile, Brian, you know, is fraying internally.
I think the outside pressure of the Beach Boys then, and you know, all of a sudden saying, hey, we can't do, how can we do that song live? You know, usually they could do the whole album, whatever songs they wanted. They couldn't do some of those songs live. I think he kept doing what he wanted to do, but he kept getting more and more pressure.
I think Brian probably got a little, I hate this word, but I have to use it, he got a little paranoid about what his next move was, you know? And I think he probably overthought it out. And Mike Love gets this horrible bad rap as trying to sabotage the Smile album. If you listen to the existing recordings of what was recorded for Smile, the band worked so hard with Brian to make this happen. But I just know Brian was, you know, very tense, and it wasn't the Brian that I'd worked with, you know. I just think his success was so big, he might have just been thinking, well, how am I going to do this?
Further problems surfaced in the form of an untimely lawsuit between Capitol Records and the Beach Boys over contracts and royalties. As the dispute rumbled through the courts, Brian was compelled to relocate to studios that would not be on the Capitol dollar. A prospective release date for Smile drifted further and further over the horizon of 1967, as Brian, buffeted by the various pressures and competing interests swirling around him, struggled to complete the album. When the new sound finally arrived in the summer, it was not from the bright skies of California, but the drizzly streets of Liverpool. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band had given rock and roll its watershed moment, and Brian Wilson capitulated, finally abandoning his grand vision and consigning Smile to the mythical realm of music's great lost work.
Let's forget about selling stuff. Just think of it as pure art. Brian would have had a 1-2 punch. It would have been great. It was all there. You've heard the fragments. You've heard some of the songs. If you link them together, it would have been a different respect for the Beach Boys.
A lot of people, I think, have done this legend thing in their head, this fable that they've created, and everyone wants to completely believe that this whole thing happened a certain way. And what I saw was different than what they're all thinking, or what they all say and keep repeating. What I saw was after the Pet Sounds album, and he started doing Cabin Essence. I'd go over to the house and he'd have a part he'd done. Water, Child is the Father of the Man, these little parts. He almost got into a series of little pocket pieces, like on Good Vibrations, because that kept on going. And I don't think he lost the ability of the freshness of knowing which part should go where. It was like, I don't know, man. I don't know. Maybe that shouldn't be the start. Maybe and he was like started again into these puzzles of putting the songs together.
One of the great ideas of romantic art is the great unfinished work. People talk about various Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The poems are unfinished. They're incomplete. They're fragments, and that in and of itself is a romantic ideal. And it's, in some sense, Smile, were it ever to have been finished back when it was supposed to be, I don't think ever could have been remotely close to achieving what the emotions and aspirations that people imbue it with. I think it potentially could have been a very great record, but it was in many ways even greater as an unfinished idea.
What we miss is what people got to see on Inside Pop: The Rock Revolution, 1967 television special by CBS News, where Brian performs Surf's Up to close the show. It's profound. Everybody who saw that special kept on asking about that song. Come about hard and join the young and often spring you gave. What beautiful lyrics for 1967, the year of all you need is love, and the year of the summer of love. This is where people are starting to say, let's come together. All that feeling was in Surf's Up, and so profoundly written, and so profoundly sung, and so profoundly spoken in those words. And they heard it once on a CBS News special, and that was it. Ether after that.
I think this music has something terribly important to tell us adults, and we would be wise not to behave like ostriches about it.
Here is a new song, too complex to get all of first time around. It could come only out of the ferment that characterizes today's pop music scene. Brian Wilson, leader of the famous Beach Boys and one of today's most important pop musicians, sings his own Surf's Up.
Dove-nested towers, the hour was struck, the straight quicksilver moon. Carriage across the fog, two-step to lamplight solitude. The laughs come hard in old lang syne. The glass was raised to fire, it rose the fullness of the wine, the dim last toast. While at port adieu.
Though Smile had been discarded, a truncated version of Heroes and Villains, the first song planned for the album, appeared as a single in July '67. The band was, however, still obliged to deliver an album, and that obligation had now become pressing. They established a studio at Brian's Bel Air home where they embarked on a crash recording of a new LP. But with their erstwhile producer much diminished by his tribulations, the crafting of a Beach Boys record had now become a different animal entirely.
If you got a hit song, you can be as crazy as you want and everyone's perfectly okay with it. But the moment there's some fractures, maybe your last song wasn't a hit, suddenly you're not cute and eccentric, you're crazy. And so Brian began to veer toward crazy as far as those people were concerned. And he began to kind of like step back. I think he was exhausted. I think his feelings were hurt, that he had been, that this resistance had cropped up. And I think he had lost his patience with trying to be the sole provider for the Beach Boys. You know, if you don't believe in me, then screw you. You know, you do it. I don't care.
I think he did lose his mind for a while, you know, because we moved up to his house. We started recording up at, they took a beautiful den and put a board over the fireplace that was magnificent. Up on the second story, they kind of cut out a little hole so they could talk to the band, and we would record. But who was producing was Mike Love and the rest of the guys, and it wasn't Brian, and it wasn't the same.
His bedroom was right above the studio, and he would lie in bed all day, not because he was spending his whole life in bed, because he was going out at night and partying with all his buddies, but he would lie there and listen to them record, and if he had any suggestions or ideas, he would either call them down from his phone, or else he would put on his robe and shamble downstairs and suggest something. And sometimes he would come in and roll up his sleeves and get things going if he felt excited about stuff. But the time at which he was willing to, you know, shepherd a song from creation through arrangement, through production, through performance was over. That he has never really done that again.
When Smiley Smile surfaced in September, it appeared to confirm the change in group dynamic. In place of the previously ubiquitous "produced by Brian Wilson" credit, the new record bore the legend "produced by the Beach Boys."
They need to finish something really quick. They get it done. It's about 2 weeks with their tried and true soul root of the group, their vocals, you know, and they record really a beautiful album. The only reason why people didn't like that album so much when it was first released because it wasn't Smile.
Accidentally, because of that commitment, Smiley Smile gets recorded, but it's kind of cool. That's the way a psychedelic album should sound. That's all vocals. There's a little Hammond organ, looks like a church organ that they had loaned Brian. I mean, that's the Beach Boys as unplugged as you're ever going to hear the band, and it's brilliant. Wind chimes? Police. I mean, even in this abridged smile called Smiley Smile, I think it's underrated. I think people should take a listen to it. It's really good.
In the late afternoon, you hung up on wind chimes. Wind chimes. Though it's hard, I try not to look at my wind chimes.
The "produced by the Beach Boys" credit was the point at which the Beach Boys stepped up and said, we're going to control this band as much as you are. And it also, to another extent, maybe was Brian saying, okay, if you guys think it's so easy, then go ahead and do it. It could have been them thinking that they were stepping up to be equals to Brian, but it was Brian also saying, you know, go ahead, that's fine, I'm going to go to my room and hang out.
I never understood that. I always thought it should say, anything should say produced by Brian. I don't know what the reasoning was to put the Beach Boys' name as the producers. Brian still was in charge, though it may sound watered down to you. It's still, Brian can't help it, but when he's good, he just is. He just is.
The reign was kind of given to the Beach Boys to get credit on that album, so he could slowly maybe wean himself over here. Good, you guys I'm not deserting you. Look, you're good on your own. I'll come in and help, but now this will give me a little time to do some new things.
And given the course of recent events, Brian actively sought to initiate new projects outside of the Beach Boys context. In a move reminiscent of his productions during the early 60s, 2 songs were written for Danny Hutton and recorded with his band Redwood. Brian displayed a keen enthusiasm for the work and discussed signing Redwood to the Beach Boys' new label, Brother Records. But just as Murray Wilson had closed the book on his previous collaborations, so a new intervention was to strangle the partnership in its infancy.
I think he was really saying, the Beach Boys have done their stuff. I've really done what I think is some incredible stuff. Now I want to start doing stuff with other people, other bands. So we were the band that he thought, you know, we were vocalists. We could play guitars and stuff, but we weren't a band that he had to fight. He could bring in his crew of people and we could do blues, hard-on blues. So I think he felt that his palette could expand in areas where he hadn't kind of get into a little Spector area, which you couldn't kind of do with the Beach Boys and vocally sometimes. You know, it was a different kind of sound. Then the Beach Boys came in town, and Mike Love hears a song called Darlin' that Brian had written, and he was pissed off. He said, "What are you giving them a hit song for?" And I can absolutely see his point. But Brian, you know, we had committed to doing it with Brian. Brian wrote the song because I used to say Darlin'. He wrote it for me, and it ended up with our voices being taken off, and there's put on it, Carl doing it. Mike is a guy that comes up with these ideas. He's very protective of the Beach Boys. It's a great legacy. And I see his side of it, but he absolutely rubs a lot of people the wrong way.
Darlin' ended life as a hit single for the Beach Boys towards the end of the year. An album followed in December and was a further step away from the large Wilson productions of old. Though, in many respects, Wild Honey predicted the stripped-down, back-to-roots aesthetic that characterized much of late 60s rock and roll.
In some sense, it's Brian Wilson's burning out and cooling out, as Carl Wilson called it. But in another sense, it is trying to go back to basics and making a simple rock and roll record. It seems during the period that Wild Honey is being made, I think Brian Wilson becomes like the first person to burn out from that whole large production thing that was happening during the mid-60s, you know? The Rolling Stones went ahead and made Satanic Majesty's Request, and they got knocked for it, for example. So, you know, meanwhile, you're getting Bob Dylan doing John Wesley Harding, and Byrds do Sweetheart of the Rodeo, and the band does music from the Big Pink. I mean, the Beatles wanted to do an album called Get Back. So people wanted to bring things down.
He really heard what he wanted to hear. I mean, it's not a piano sound that I would go looking for. I mean, some of it is almost like a muffled piano and sort of a bass back there, but they're very true to the songs, and they're very true to where he was at the time. And it is a stripped down, you know, I think a couple of those piano parts might be from the little upright that we had in the studio.
Wild Honey was a great album. You know, Wild Honey was just kind of like, you know, when the fighter's in the ring and they ring the bell and they get to go sit in the corner. That was just, you know, we're just blown away off the planet listening to Motown and stuff, and that was a really fun album to make. It was easy and simple, and we made it at Brian's house for the most part. That was a cool album. We kind of went, pressure's off, let's just do this. That was a fun album to make, and it gave everyone a chance to take a rest from being so tragically hip and cool. It really pulled the band together.
But times were changing. 1968 saw the United States descend into one of the bleakest periods in its history. The assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, growing militancy amongst the youth, and a series of political convulsions had pitched America into a divisive, confrontational malaise. Amid all the ferment, the Beach Boys' summer album Friends failed entirely to relate to the cultural zeitgeist and sank without a trace.
Well, by the late 60s, they didn't seem to fit anywhere in the popular culture, because in the post-Summer of Love period, particularly starting in 1968, when it was all riots and, you know, the anti-war movement had become violent to a great extent, you know, to some extent. And there were political assassinations back to back, you know, Martin Luther King and then Bobby Kennedy, and a whole sort of Dionysian kind of strain of pop music really came to the fore. 5-1, baby. With the Doors and heavy metal music or hard rocking music, power trios and Jimi Hendrix. The Beach Boys just were headed in the opposite direction.
You get yours, baby, I'll get mine.
They didn't really fit. I mean, the way maybe they would have liked to commercially and in the traditional business of it. And I think they were a little bit lost and a little bit, gee, where do we go from here? I mean, didn't quite know what their image was, didn't know where to go with it, and so it was a difficult period, I think, for sure.
I do think that Friends ended up being, to me, what is the most natural follow-up to the Smile album there could have been. This is an album that's bliss, you know. It's one of the best records the Beach Boys ever made. It was like a low charter. It didn't have hits. It didn't matter.
We've been friends now for so many years. We've been together through the good times and tears. Turned each other on to the good things that life has to give.
No, that's a pretty lightweight album. You know, I mean, I love Friends. I love the song Friends. I thought that was really great, really great. Mike had been hanging out with Maharishi and Lennon and George Harrison a lot in India. So that's the album that has Transcendental Meditation in it, where Brian sang all the vocal parts. I thought it was kind of clever, but the album, I'm surprised it got to 126. Maybe 1,026 might be more appropriate.
It wasn't talked about, no one cared. What was happening in 1968 was the Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil. That kind of street fighting man record that the Stones were coming out with, that was a valid record in 1968. Singing about bliss and floating on the inner tube of life and space and love and meditation, that wasn't what was happening.
At the twilight of the decade, the Beach Boys' fortunes continued to wane, and Brian, bereft of all the inspiration from their earlier halcyon days, demonstrated less and less interest in recording with the band, or indeed working at all. As the 1970s progressed, he slipped into an ever-worsening depression and eventually retreated from public life altogether.
On the one hand, he was living a kind of just a normal, eccentric person's lifestyle, but he had good times and bad times. He had times when he was just sort of being silly and living this kind of weird, young, rich, eccentric lifestyle, and times when he seemed to be spiraling more into a darker kind of depression.
He became huge. Couldn't believe how big he became. You would have never believed the beard that he had. He looked like Santa Claus. We didn't see Brian for the longest time. We didn't know what happened. You couldn't ask anybody, you couldn't talk to anybody about it. And I remember Terry Melcher, God bless him, Terry called me one day and said, Hal, I want you to get the guys together. We're going to do a session with Brian. I said, really? He said, yeah, now tell the guys no laughing, no staring. We hadn't seen him for a while. Be careful with the jokes, no matter what. Okay. It was a terribly sad day. We'd all sitting there, waiting. The door opened, Brian came in and looked around a little bit, strange, walked over to the piano, and he sat down and he started playing the intro to one of their hits. I forget what the song was. And we knew exactly what the song was. And Brian was playing this, and he kept looking at me. He's saying, like he didn't know me. He said, "Do you know this song?" I said, "Yeah, Brian, I love that song, man. I love it." Ding-a-ding, ding-a-ding. "Do you know this song?" "Yeah, Brian, I love this song. It's a great song." 3 or 4 times he did this to me. And after about the 3rd or 4th time, he said, "You know this song?" "Yeah, I love that song." He closed it up, got up, and he walked in. That was it. We didn't see him again.
It's interesting, as the years have gone on, I think their reputation has only gotten better and better. 40 plus years later, you're more sort of avant-garde, edgy, alternative musicians, I think, to a person will acknowledge the importance and probably even a devotion to Brian Wilson's work. The amount of imagination, risk-taking, the eccentricity of it is something that just resonates across the ages.
Brian Wilson is not just a songwriter. He's, in his early days, thinking about the whole experience of the song, the way it's presented, the way it's recorded, the way it's performed. In other words, he's not depending on someone else to be the producer or the arranger. He's doing it all himself. He's more than just a songwriter, he's more of a composer in the great tradition of great composers.
The innocence that started off as the Beach Boys, the music, the innocence in the music, the fact that it hit home and lit a spark in so many people around the world and made so many people happy. That's the main thing. The music made people happy. And to this day, you can go to a concert and you see children that know all the words to those songs. And you see people in their 70s dancing in the aisles. And that's Brian Wilson's legacy.
The fact that he managed, 35 years later to dust himself off and not only reclaim the smile he had written, but finish the work, transforms Brian's story. It sort of takes us from the object lesson in American greed and commodification. It snatched that away. Even in the shadows of all that, there is still a spark of real genius. And I think that's what people hear now these days when an old Beach Boys song comes on the air. It's that same story, that emotional story, that same sense of daring and ambition and hope and fear that guides us all through our days.